Hello, dear Misfits. Hope you're ready for another multiple-hour weekly episode. Tonight we'll talk about park rangers, deep woods, and horror that happens inside our national parks and forests. As always, do subscribe and hit that like button. And now, story time.
My hiking partner and I arrived in the Kennecott area, intending to reach the campsites near the glacier. However, it started to get too dark for us, so we decided to camp at the first available site. We found a small spot right off the trail, set up camp, and hung our supplies in a tree. Down the trail, we started a fire and were just finishing a small meal when I walked to the trail to smoke. I had been standing on the trail for a few minutes when I noticed what I thought was a person on a bike coming down the trail. I immediately let my partner know, but when I looked back, it was still in the same spot. I started looking more closely to see a face or the bike, but then I realized it was not a person. It was a large, dark form with its legs spread apart. This is what led me to think it was a person on a bike. The arms were curled at its side, like someone with hands on handlebars too big for a pair, and the legs were too far apart. I called my partner, but when I turned back to look at it again, it moved very quickly into the woods on two legs. The next day, we searched, but found no evidence of anything on the trail. I've told this story to a few people, but they all think I'm crazy. I hope this helps. I know what I saw, and I guess I'm just hoping somebody believes me. I'm a 24-year-old male, and I live in the middle of nowhere, literally. I'll be brief and straightforward about my encounter. I was returning home late one day after dropping my sister off at the airport in Lamar, Colorado. I live just under 7 miles north of the Oklahoma border on roughly 250 acres of land. I have a trap line running around my property for coyotes. The first 2 traps I checked were empty, so I headed south. That's when I saw this thing. At first, I thought it was a coyote, just a really big one. It was almost 5 feet tall and on all fours. It had gotten caught in my trap and was running around, kicking up dust. Then it suddenly stopped and looked right at me. I use a Duke No. 3 leg hold trap, so it can catch a variety of animals. Anyway, I slammed on the brakes, and my truck stalled because it's a manual. I was fumbling for the keys to start it. It's an old farm truck with a carburetor, and it had quite an after-fire. Once it heard that, it lunged at me and roared. I noticed that it had its hand, not a paw, but an actual hand, caught in my trap, the right hand, to be exact. It had probably been looking for the dead rabbit I had in the bait hole next to the trap. Then it stood up and ripped out the 2 earth anchors I had driven 24 inches into the ground. It had taken me a long time to put them in with a 10-pound hammer, but it pulled them straight out like it was nothing. Just 15 seconds after that, it just stood there, looking at me. It felt like an eternity, and I knew my .357 Magnum would be of no use against this thing if it came at me. I prayed to God Almighty that it wouldn't come for me and my truck. I was looking at it in shock and awe and noticed that it had orange amber eyes. They weren't glowing, but they had a tint like a cat's eyes in the dark. They may have been reflecting my headlights, I can't be too sure. Then, it took a step toward me, curled its upper lip, showing me its teeth, which were humongous, 4 to 5 inches long, easily. It growled at me and then disappeared in the blink of an eye. I was scared out of my wits. I slammed the truck into gear, spun the tires, and got out of there. As I mentioned earlier, it seemed like an eternity, but it must have lasted no more than 30 seconds at most. I later returned with an Indian friend of mine whom I grew up with and trusted. He told me some stories that had been passed down through his grandparents' tribe, mentioning something about a loup-garou or the French werewolf. He also told me how fur trappers in the late 1700s to the 1800s were chased off the land in the Rockies by this creature. My hunting buddy and I were sitting on a ridge, watching for caribou about 1,000 yards away, and a large clearing was in view. While we were glassing the clearing for caribou to come out of the brush, we observed a large, gray animal walking on hind legs between two large spruce trees on opposite sides of the clearing. We were both longtime Alaskans and avid hunters, having logged many hunts in North America. I have hunted all of North America's deer, elk, black and grizzly bears, but I had never seen an animal like what we saw that day. We watched it for over half an hour as it moved from one tree across the clearing to the other tree. Eventually, caribou moved into the area, and we lost sight of the animal when it moved off into heavy, thick brush. We had never heard of a Bigfoot in Alaska, but we did tell the bush pilot who picked us up from our hunt that we had seen something strange. He told us that we had probably seen the hairy man, a well-known creature in the region among the native people. First, let me start by saying that this is entirely true. I won't disclose the exact location of the events that took place, but it all happened in the Bald Hills in Washington state. I don't know why they're called the Bald Hills since they aren't really bald. It's filled with forests and woods. The Deschutes River runs through it, and the river was just behind my house, across a field where we generally kept our horses. Around the river was all rocky terrain, and just beyond that lay endless woods. There were very few houses around there, and it was literally in the middle of nowhere. This all happened about 9 or 10 years ago when I was in 4th grade. Now that's out of the way, let's get to my story. So, the house was occupied by 5 heads, 6 including a friend. It was me, my 3 brothers, my oldest sister, the only one who could drive, and a friend. Our dad was a truck driver, so he was gone for long periods of time, and my mother lost the battle to cancer when I was 5 years old. We invited our friend to spend the weekend after school, and he brought his PS2, and we were ready to pull all-nighters on GTA Vice City. Well, something else decided to change our plans. When it got dark, my friend and I decided to go outside and hang out. I was 10 or 11, and he was 14. While we were in our yard, we began to hear footsteps in our driveway, which was very odd. Our yard was surrounded by a chain-linked fence with 2 gates at different points of the yard. So, while staying in the yard, we did our best to try and see if we could spot who was here while remaining hidden. We couldn't see anything. It was much too dark. However, we did manage to make out something wandering around in the driveway. It was a fairly large driveway that led up a steep hill. My friend summoned the courage and yelled out to it, stating that it was on private property, which may have been a mistake. The footsteps stopped for a few seconds, then started moving towards us. I looked at my friend's face, and he was in shock. Whoever or whatever was walking around didn't say anything. It just started coming towards us. We bolted inside, speaking faster than our minds could think, telling everyone what was happening. My sister was sleeping at the time, and we didn't want to bother her, but my friend and I were freaking out, and my 3 brothers were getting concerned as well. So, we woke up my sister and told her to call the police. She got annoyed because she thought we were losing it and told us to leave her alone, saying she had work in the morning. Eventually, she gave in and grabbed the dogs, we had 5, and went outside with a flashlight to take a look around. She put on her rubber boots and jacket and went outside, walking around to prove us wrong that nothing was out there. She walked out of the yard and around the outside of the chain-linked fence. My friend and I waited on the deck, watching her. She walked by an old wood shed where we stored wood, and then it happened. A blood-curdling scream came from inside the woods, just behind the woodshed. It sent shivers down my spine and filled me with fear. My sister immediately shined the flashlight into the woodshed. My friend and I ran inside, cowards, I know. My sister came in a little later, assuming it was just a raccoon and that she didn't see anything else. That put us all at ease, and we went to play GTA. No more than an hour later, we began to hear something outside the house. We all froze again. My sister had gone back to bed, and we didn't want to wake her up again. We paused the game, not making a move. The footsteps made their way onto the deck of the house, and they walked by the sliding glass door, luckily covered with curtains. They weren't steps like shoes or boots, it was more like padding, like feet. My oldest brother suggested that we all go into the basement and hide in his room. We did just that, and we all grabbed a weapon of some kind, whether it was a baseball bat or a kitchen knife. We all hung out in my oldest brother's room, and I eventually fell asleep. When I woke up, it was morning, and I was very afraid to look outside through the windows, fearing that something might be looking back at me. I finally gathered the courage to look, and there was nothing. Nothing was outside. My brothers, my friend, and I explored outside to see what we could find. We discovered several footprints in the mud, and our picnic table was smashed to pieces. The gates were bent and wouldn't open anymore. My dad had to fix them. We explored the back parts of the woods just behind the house, and there, what we saw was a little teepee made of sticks. We'd kick it down, and it kept getting rebuilt the next day or two. From that day on, we were very frightened to explore the woods out there. However, one day, a few years later, just before we moved, I was outside in the dark alone. The only sound was the rushing river and some wind rustling the large pine trees. I was in the backyard alone, leaning against the chain-linked fence with my flashlight, peering into the field behind the house, seeing if I could spot anything interesting, particularly the monster. Then I caught two glares, a pair of eyes from inside the woods. They were focused on me and took several steps forward, out into the clearing, and stopped. My flashlight wasn't powerful enough, so all I saw were some eye glares. It was roughly 20 to 30 feet away from me, but it was definitely close enough to startle me. For a long time, I just stood there, shining my flashlight at it as it stared back at me. I was too scared to go up and look at it closely, so over time, I turned around and headed back inside. That was the last time I saw the creature of the Bald Hills. A couple of friends and I were born in December when I decided we should take a walk through the woods behind my house. I didn't think much of it, as my friends and I had done it many times before. There were 4 of us, and we set out at about 11 o'clock at night. It was rather dark, but there was some light from the moon. The weather was quite cold since we did this in the winter. The area we walked on consisted of game trails, which moose typically used, as well as trails for mushers, runners, and cross-country skiers. We had walked about 2 miles from my house to another entrance, where most people usually enter. On the way, we talked about unexplainable events and things like Bigfoot or UFOs. When we reached the bridge where most people entered, one friend smoked a cigarette. It was then that we saw a light and decided to move on. On the way back, we heard a wild dog barking frantically and decided to pick up the pace. It eventually turned into a sprint. While we walked, we continued talking about it, and it was then that I realized something had been following us, testing us, or even harassing us. This had started much earlier, but I hadn't thought much about it. I initially thought it was my friend Warren, who was sometimes clumsy, making noises like slipping, but it turned out to be something throwing things at us. I realized this about halfway back. I asked if Warren kept slipping, and he told me he wasn't, thinking I might be playing a prank on him. We stopped for a minute to listen, and I told the others that something strange was happening. We shone a flashlight around, hearing noises like footsteps and branches moving and breaking. The leader thought I might be playing a joke, but when I assured him I wasn't, he decided to walk behind me. That's when something threw snowballs at us, nearly hitting us on several occasions. It was then that he realized this was no joke, and we picked up a light jog for most of the way. When we were almost out of the woods, we heard dogs again, maybe 20 feet away, branches breaking, and something throwing stuff at us. By the time we left, it was about 3 to 3:30 in the morning. I didn't go directly to my house because I didn't know if it was still following us. I knew it was not a prank because the snow in the woods was more than 5 feet deep, making it extremely challenging for someone to play a prank like that. This happened in February of 2004, up near the power line clearings east of Potter Marsh outside of Anchorage. 2 of my friends and I were bored one night, so we decided to do a little snow machining. Even though it was generally believed to be illegal to snow machine in Anchorage, there were some good trails to ride on a little north of my house. We set off at around 11 p.m., riding for about a quarter of a mile before cutting onto the trails. There had been about 10 inches of fresh snowfall a few days prior, so there were no tracks on the trails. I was leading the way for about half an hour, and then we stopped and talked for a little bit. After our break, we took off again, continuing to cruise along some kind of game trail that led to an opening in the woods. I rode into the opening with my friends following about 50 yards behind me. As I came over a small mound, I saw strange tracks leading to a spot in the snow where it looked like something had pushed aside some snow and laid down. Initially, I thought it might be a moose or something, but I followed the tracks over the next small hill. As I came down the far side, my headlight pointed directly at the back of a Bigfoot, which was only about 10 to 12 feet in front of me. It was running in the opposite direction, and I slammed on the brakes because I was terrified. The creature continued to run away, leaping over a dead log covered in snow, and then it disappeared into a group of trees, vanishing into the darkness. I was so surprised and scared that I quickly turned around and rode back towards my friends. I met them back by the first mound and told them, "We need to get out of here," and we rode back toward my house. When I shared the experience with my friends near my house, they laughed and suggested it was probably a bear or someone in the woods. However, I was 100% certain that it was neither a bear nor anything else. The way it ran through the deep snow left me convinced it wasn't anything human. For a long time, I was made fun of, and everyone told me I was crazy, so I don't like talking about it. I'm sharing the story because I was forced to sit through it during New Year's Eve dinner and I'm so freaked out and goddamn itchy that I need to get it out of my system. I'm sure some of you are going to breeze on by this little tantrum here and go right to the meat of the story because you're thinking, "Hey, I've got a strong stomach." Well, go for it. Boring stuff out of the way, he was drafted, and since he was short and skinny, he was a perfect tunnel rat. Those were the guys who wriggled their way through the ridiculously narrow tunnels the Viet Cong used to transport personnel and weapons, set booby traps, and all that. And when I say narrow, I mean narrow. So, Gramps was wriggling around in a tunnel one day and a few bad things happened. First, the 2 other people with him got killed by a solitary VC while they were standing around the hole. Being a few feet underground and about 20 feet through meant Grandpa couldn't see who attacked them or know if anyone survived. He later learned he was the only one left alive, but he assumed the VC attacker would soon start throwing grenades into the tunnel and he'd be done for. After a few minutes with no sign of any incoming attack, Grandpa breathed a sigh of relief and started moving forward again. A little while later, though, it started pouring rain. The tunnel began to fill with water. Now, in an unfinished, unsupported tunnel like he was in, a rainstorm usually meant death for a tunnel rat. He'd heard horror stories from the squadmates who'd lost others underground, never to be seen again. He figured he'd be another. But he wasn't going to go out without a fight. He crawled forward. With him, he carried a small pistol and a Fulton flashlight. Originally, he'd been sent down to ambush some VC soldiers who were thought to be hidden in one of the tunnel's larger chambers. He'd crawl through, surprise them, blow their brains out, and wiggle his way back out. At least, that's how his first 3 tunnel trips had gone. This one, his 4th, wasn't going so well. The tunnel narrowed as he crawled. Ahead of him, he heard rushing water. He thought it might mean the main chamber was nearby. He was wrong. The sound was the muddy ground above him sloshing downward, sealing the tunnel ahead. This is where he started to panic. He knew he wasn't particularly deep in the ground, maybe 2.5 feet, but if he didn't start clawing upward through the ground really, really fast, he'd be a dead man. So he clawed. His fingernails tore off and his hands got cut up really bad, but he was able to get part of his arm and face out of the mud. He was unable to move any farther. His lower back was pushed hard into the dirt and the angle had him bent into an elongated U shape. His legs were trapped. Above him, a square foot of light shone through where he'd escape if he weren't stuck. He knew if it started to storm again, he'd drown. But the rain didn't come. Insects did. Ants were first. Luckily, they weren't the big red ones everyone over there was terrified of. The ones with the bite that felt like you got shot. These were tiny black ones, but there were lots of them. He assumed when the tunnel flooded, they were driven from their homes. Now they crawled over his scalp, face, and neck. They didn't bite, but they tickled and itched. Those which found their way onto his lips were licked off and swallowed. He figured he'd be going a while without food. After a while, the ants lost interest. Flies became a problem, though. To see why, you need to know the position in which he was stuck. The twisted, awkward angle of his body left one arm stretched out in front of him, but his shoulder and upper back were immobile. So, he had a bit of movement in his upper arm, wrist, and hand, but anything below his elbow might as well have been paralyzed. Why is this relevant? Because his armpit was exposed. Not by much, maybe an inch of clearance, but that was more than enough for the flies. And they were very, very attracted to the warm, moist pit. Over the course of an hour, 20 to 30 fat, brownish black flies dove into his right armpit. They stayed for a little while, usually no more than 6 or 7 at a time, before they flew away. Of course, while inside, they bit. The pain was sharp and awful, he said. It reminded him of that deep, pinching itch of the horse flies on the beach near where he grew up. And he couldn't stop them from doing anything. He just ground his teeth. As the sun went down, the flies started to lose interest and flew away. He knew a few stayed nestled inside because he felt them moving against the thick hair of his armpit, but the majority had gone. Now just mosquitoes remained to torment him with their endless bites and bottomless gullets. Somehow, he slept. From the moment the sun came up, new insects visited him. Of all the massive, tropical bugs he'd seen in Vietnam, he was grateful to have so far avoided the giant centipedes he'd heard about. Massive, angry things as long as a man's forearm and as thick as a bottle of beer. One of his more sadistic squadmates hid one in the bunk of another poor bastard. It bit his feet and toes 10 times before he could even jerk himself out of the bed. Grandpa hated even the tiny ones that he sometimes found in his basement back home, so the thought of those big ones made his blood run cold. God help you. 5 minutes after he opened his eyes to the morning light, one of them crawled onto his hand and wrapped itself around his wrist. He was too horrified to move. The little movement he had in his hand and wrist might have been enough to fling it away, but he didn't want to take a chance. So, he waited. Apparently the thing liked Grandpa, because it remained on him for well over an hour before Grandpa couldn't take the stress anymore. He tried to grab the bug in his fist. The moment he started moving, the thing began to bite. Grandpa was able to get a good grip on it and squeezed as hard as he could. The centipede broke in half in his hand and sent disgusting juices down his arm. The 2 pieces of its body dropped into the hole. The front part still had some life in it, and as it died, it bit Grandpa on the nose and lips until he was forced to take its head in his teeth and kill it. He described the taste to us, but I'm just not going to write it out. Yeah, it was that awful. The rest of that day was spent suffering as flies swarmed around the carcass of the centipede. They couldn't get enough of it. For long hours he watched them eat and shit and F all over the monstrous bug. The juice on his arm, too, which had dribbled all the way down into his armpit, was also like the nectar of the gods for the flies. More and more of them flew in and out of his armpit. He could tell more were staying within its moist confines, too, The pinching and itching and tickling sensations were occasionally more torturous than the nastily swollen centipede bites. Ants, too, noticed of the centipede corpse. This time, the little black ones weren't the only variant. The red monsters with the hideous jaws had arrived. Grandpa lucked out, though. They were more interested in killing the smaller ants than bothering him. He did say one of them bit the corner of his left eye, but the pain was much less than what the pussies at camp were always bitching about. It was here my cousin told him that he missed his calling as a gender studies professor, to which Grandpa simply replied by slapping him on the side of the head and saying, "I don't appreciate jokes about that field of study." What a complex man. Anyway, back in hell, it had started to rain. This was a mixed blessing for Grandpa. The majority of bugs scurried away to find higher ground, but he was fairly certain the hole was going to fill with water and he'd drown. Well, it didn't, and he didn't. He even got a chance to drink some rainwater. He'd been without any real food or water for well over 24 hours at that point, so he was grateful to swallow the few tablespoons worth he managed to get. There was a scary moment when the dirt below his hips shifted downward and he thought he was going to fall and get buried. Again, he lucked out. The shift was minor. He'd been pinned in that strange, elongated U-shape for a while, and having a tiny bit of the pressure relieved around his groin was definitely a plus. He was able to wiggle his hips and butt a little and figured there was maybe an inch or two of clearance in that area, but nothing that allowed him to get any hope of crawling out. He drifted to sleep at dusk and was woken up before dawn by severe pain in his armpit. He'd known all along that flies were busy damaging his skin and probably eating it. He was resigned to that fact. As long as it wasn't another centipede, he wasn't going to complain. But this pain was new and it was exquisite. The bites came much more frequently and he felt a lot of them moving around. That pain, despite its severity, was dwarfed by what came next. Let me just make this known, I don't want to tell this part of the story. Just thinking about it makes me cringe. But god damn it, it's essential to his experience. And I'm sorry in advance for you having to read it. I'll try to make it quick. The shifting downward of the dirt was the result of an ant colony collapsing. A big one. All the ants came up out of the wreckage and had been hanging out on the surface of the dirt right below Grandpa's hips. But as he started to settle into the new position overnight, the ants became agitated and swarmed him. And by him, I mean his crotch. Maybe the only thing that equaled the level of horror at the table as he talked about ants crawling into his penis and rectum was how hard my grandmother laughed as he told it. "You've got to get really close to see the scars," she exclaimed, as tears of laughter ran down her cheeks. My brother Derek's new girlfriend turned green and left the table with Derek hurrying after her. Grandma and Grandpa shared a kiss and he continued with the story. With ants up his dick and asshole and flies building a housing project in his armpit, Grandpa suffered through the next 2 days in a haze of pain and fear. The lack of food and water had taken a toll on him. This, he told us, was somewhat helpful. The pain grew less acute as his consciousness waxed and waned. A tarantula wandered into the hole and Grandpa was able to bite its abdomen in half and suck out what was inside. This, of course, attracted more flies, but there was nothing he could do about it. If he didn't get some food and water in him, he'd die. His survival instinct was still intact despite all the trauma. A couple more days went by and he blurrily realized he'd been stuck for about a week. The rainfalls and insect pulp had kept him hydrated just enough to stay alive. His armpit was numb all the way down to the last rib on his right side. Flies were ignoring everything else and just going straight in and out of the pit. The adventurous ants had lost interest after a while, but every so often he felt a nasty pinch on one incredibly sensitive area or another. More time passed. Late one afternoon, he heard gunfire. He'd heard quite a bit while he was stuck, but it was always off in the distance and too far for him to get any hope that he'd be rescued. This time, though, it was very close. He was overwhelmed with a sense of hope which was tainted by the concern that he'd be found by the wrong side. But, to his astonishment, It wasn't the VC who he heard shouting after all the gunfire. Grandpa starting waving his arm with the tiny bit of movement he could muster. He heard someone yell, "Hey, there's an arm over here." Grandpa yelled back incoherently and was soon greeted by the sight of a US soldier peering down at him. It took him and his squad mates 10 minutes to dig Grandpa out of the hole. He remembers all of them saying some variant of "holy shit" after they'd freed him. Someone radioed their position, and after some unknown amount of time, a helicopter landed in a nearby clearing. Grandpa was loaded onto a stretcher and they lifted off. A medic who was along for the ride cut off Grandpa's shirt and promptly threw up. When the rest of the soldiers in the chopper looked at what the medic had seen, a few of them also rained puke down from the side of the aircraft. A few days after being rescued, Grandpa woke up in a hospital. Not one on the base, either, one in the US. He had no idea how he got there. Once he was rescued, he passed out and slept for almost 36 straight hours. Some people thought he was in a coma until some poor medic tried to wake him up and Grandpa said F off and knocked the guy out with a single shot to the chin. Now awake, the doctors told Grandpa the extent of his injuries. Aside from the severe dehydration, he was absolutely riddled with infected bites. The ones on his more sensitive areas weren't much cause for alarm, despite their unpleasantness. It was the bigger bites that were much more of a concern. The one from the red ant was the worst, and for a while the doctors worried he'd lose the eye. His lips and nose had terrible swelling from the infected centipede bites. Even though all those bites were awful, he could have recovered in a few weeks and would have been back in the tunnel soon after. But his armpit was why he was sent home. Botflies are a type of insect which lay their eggs inside flesh. Until Grandpa's experience, no one knew they even had them in Vietnam. But apparently they do. The underside of his right arm all the way down to nearly his hip was completely reshaped into horrible cavities for their larvae. The doctors wouldn't operate, saying the only way to excise them was to let them gestate, and at a certain point, suffocate them with adhesive tape so they'd crawl to the surface. It took another few weeks, but that's what happened. Grandpa regaled us with the story of how he personally gave birth to 313 botfly larvae. Then he lifted up his shirt to show us the pockmarked skin. No one said much after that. He was done with the story, and after shoveling a slice of fruit cake into his mouth, he and Grandma left. They laughed all the way to the door. I don't really know what else to say. So yeah. That's Grandpa. Happy New Year. This happened about 8 years ago. To this day I keep wondering what happened to come across my sister. It was wintertime here in the suburbs of Northern Virginia. I live with my family in a neighborhood not far from Washington, D.C., Dale City, so it's not to say we're in the middle of nowhere. Although, our home is very close to a few decently large wooded parks. One night I was at my then girlfriend's place up near the city. I got a phone call from my sister around 7 p.m., which in winter time makes it pretty much nighttime here. I didn't think anything of it. Usually, she calls me for random things she needs my insight on. A bit about my sister: ever since she was little she loved horror movies. Growing up with her I can tell you firsthand that she isn't easily scared. She loves the paranormal. Alright, so back to the call. I picked up the phone and the first thing I realized was her voice breaking up. She was sobbing and could barely talk clearly. Instantly my mind started rushing with horrible thoughts about what could have happened. She kept telling me to come home, as soon as possible. I asked her why. Is everything okay? She wouldn't say, she just kept asking me to come home. Obviously, I got in my car and rushed home. The neighborhood is very dim, there aren't many lights, only a few solar-powered garden lamps from surrounding homes. As soon as I got home I ran inside, and asked her again what happened, and she finally started explaining. About half an hour before she called me, she went outside to grab a few things from her car. Again, it was dark out, but when the car was unlocked the headlights turned on. When she opened the door to the car, The light was shining from the driveway to the roof of the garage. She noticed it first from inside the car. A short, bipedal, human-looking thing, standing on two jet-black muscular legs. At first, she said she thought it was a raccoon, but this would have been obvious to her. But this thing scared her to the point of crying while she was in the car. Her view was obstructed by the rest of the creature, which was crouching, and from what she described, it was scratching at something on the roof. Trying to get in? Maybe, but she wasn't going to stick around to find out. She got out of the car pretending to not have spotted it. This thing, it acted in a seemingly intelligent way. She thought, maybe if I act as if I didn't see it, it will just stay up there and not try to attack or anything. But as she walked behind the car, she heard it stand upright. Startled, she looked directly at it. The whole description she told me was as follows. Jet black, smooth dolphin skin like legs and arms. 5-digit hands and no claws. Dreadful looking, very dirty fur or hair, covering its head or body. The face is what was disturbing. The face had 2 shining yellow eyes that glowed from the car's headlights, no nose, just 2 slits, and a very wide mouth with no lips. She took off when she made eye contact. As soon as she was indoors, she called 911 and an officer was dispatched to our house. He looked around back and tried to see if there was any damage or sign of someone climbing the roof. No footprints, no damage. It was all in place. The officer just told us to lock the doors and windows and left. It's not like my sister to be terrified to the point of calling the police. Whatever this thing was though, I can only imagine what it was actually like to witness something like it in real life. To this day, both I and her get extremely uneasy arriving home after dark. I'm a pretty avid runner. I've been quitting a lot of bad habits, and exercise just does the trick for me. I have a greenway behind my house that I can run or bike on. It's very beautiful, and during the day, plenty of people are there. Well, about a week ago, I ran through the greenway to stop by a friend's house and grab something. By the time I got back onto the greenway, the sun was already starting to set, and the path was getting dark. As I was walking back through the path, I had my flashlight on and kept looking around me. I felt paranoid being alone in the dark. As I was walking, I distinctly remember hearing my grandma's voice call my name from the tree line. It sounded so real and normal that I turned around instantly, only to immediately go cold, realizing that my grandma is deceased. This freaked me out, but I tried my best to somewhat convince myself that I was just hallucinating because I was paranoid. Only about a minute later, I turned around behind me with my flashlight out of fear. That's when I saw it. It looked like a gray blob, pretty much like a human sprinting at me full speed in the pitch black. I screamed like a little scared child, and I don't think I've ever run so fast in my life. When I got home, I tried to laugh it off as me seeing things and being overly anxious. But about a week later, I can't stop thinking about it. It sounded so real. I heard her voice clear as day. And the person chasing me looked so real. I've heard all those stories about skinwalkers, and while I doubt their existence, my experience was so similar to that of skinwalker encounters that I'm seriously questioning myself. What do you guys think? Is it possible that my brain was just hallucinating out of fear and anxiety? In the early 1980s, I lived in a small town near the southwest part of the Chattahoochee National Forest in Georgia. I was hunting on public land in the national forest just up the road from home in an area known as Cooper's Creek. I've hunted in and around that area for years and was very familiar with the terrain. When I located a good spot that I thought would give me a good chance at a large buck, I set up my lock-on tree stand about 12 feet off the ground. I was hunting with a 12-gauge shotgun since rifle hunting is not allowed in this area. So, fast forward to early November. I had been hunting in my tree stand several times. This particular hunt was during the late afternoon around 4:15 p.m. I wanted to get there earlier, but I was held up at work. This was a Friday afternoon and my wife knew that I would not be home until 8:30 p.m. and even later if I had bagged a deer. I parked my truck at the trailhead and started hiking into the woods to my tree stand. The walk would take about 20 minutes. I moved slowly through the woods since I didn't want to spook any of the wildlife. As I was walking, I noticed how quiet it was. Eerily quiet. I finally arrived, climbed up, and settled in. I began to survey my surroundings. I began to have a disconcerting feeling like somebody was watching me. I just felt like something was out of place. After a while, I kept looking at my watch wondering how much time I had left until dusk. I thought that I should leave early because of how I was feeling. Then, I caught movement to my right side. I slowly turned my head and began looking through the tree canopy. That's when I saw IT. I honestly don't know what IT was. I was staring into the trees and I saw what looked like a large human body, but it was completely blurred. It was moving through the trees. I could clearly see the outline of the figure, but the rest was all blurry. I couldn't focus on it. It resembled an out-of-focus blob of gelatin that was in the shape of a human. Whenever it would stop moving, I completely lost sight of it as it blended into its surroundings. I continued to watch it stop and then start moving. I do so for about 15 minutes. By that time, I was starting to become scared as I was thinking about my walk back to the truck. So I waited for another 15 minutes or so. It was getting dark by then, so I slowly climbed out of my stand. Once I hit the solid ground, I wasted no time. I sprinted all the way back to my truck. I quickly jumped into the cab. I just sat there in my truck and tried to regain my breath. I drove home and said nothing to my wife or anybody else for several weeks. During that time, I tried to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. I eventually told my wife one night. She listened and said that it was probably my imagination. I later told my brother, who said something similar to my wife. I never told anyone else. I never hunted in those woods again. I didn't even go back for the tree stand. I took a break from hunting for about 5 years. I then started up again, but never in that area. I still wonder what I saw that day. I have no rational explanation. Years later, I think in 1988, the movie Predator was released. When I saw the cloaked alien on the screen, I immediately tensed up in fear. That is what I saw. I was shocked. Did I encounter an alien? I still wonder what it was that I saw that day. I no longer hunt or spend much time in the woods. I saw a thing in, or near, the woods on 3 separate occasions now. Each time I saw the thing, it was in a different state along the east coast of America, and each time the sighting was fleeting. I'm in my 30s now, and the sightings have several years between them. The first time I saw it was in high school, and this is most definitely the time I got the longest look at it. The second time I only caught a glimpse, and I'm pretty sure, but not entirely sure, it was the same thing. The third time I got a clear look at it from a distance, but it caught me so off guard that I stumbled as I was taking a step and I lost sight of it. I have been calling it a thing because I have no idea what it is, and quite honestly I don't even have a good guess either. It was not a Sasquatch, a wildman, a rake, a lizard person, or any other creature I have found through my incredibly frustrating recent internet research on the subject matter. Maybe a shapeshifter of some kind, because the first time I saw it, the thing changed its form for sure. Yes, I said it changed its form. You can go ahead and leave now if you like. If you are someone like me who will rely on science for validation, you try to keep an open mind, but you also tend to explain away people's paranormal encounters for any number of different reasons. Also, I would have expected that if I ever did end up seeing something otherworldly, it might be something that someone else had seen before, right? This post is the first time I have put any of this out there to anyone, and if it weren't for this last encounter, I would have forgotten the first 2 again. I have never mentioned this to anyone because of how ridiculous it sounds, the fact that I have no proof. I'm pretty much exactly the person you would think might make something like this up. At this point, though I only want to get this off my chest to hopefully find out if anyone else has ever seen this thing. Before I begin telling you what happened, I would like to make it clear that I swear what you read here is the truth about what I saw as best as I can remember. If you don't believe it, fine, whatever, I get that. This is the reason I am posting what happened here, and it is the reason that I have never, and will never, told anyone I might have to see in my daily life. I'm sure they would think I'm crazy or just desperate for attention because what I saw is downright absurd. Well, now that I have thoroughly destroyed any credibility I may have once had, I will tell you what I saw as best as I can. I have been thinking about exactly how I might explain this to someone for a while now, so I will do my best to keep out of a narrative tone. Well, now that I have thoroughly destroyed any credibility I may have once had, I will attempt to explain the details about what I saw as bluntly as possible with as vivid of a recollection as I have of the events. 1. First sighting, Southern New Hampshire, 2000 or 2001 summer probably, I don't remember exactly when, well after midnight. I am going to take some time to explain this first encounter in as much detail as I can recall, even though it all happened so fast, literally lasting in total maybe 10 seconds. It is still the longest amount of time I have spent truly looking at the thing. I was walking to a friend's house from the apartment complex I lived in late at night. To get from one place to the other quickly, you had to cut through a small patch of forest, roughly 100 yards, that was technically someone else's property. A couple of times before we had someone shine a light on us, and once he fired a shot in the air to try and scare us in an attempt to get us to stop cutting through. But it never did stop us. It did, however, teach me to be stealthier when cutting through, and so on this night. I was creeping very quietly through the trees as I went. The forest was in a valley between my apartment complex, some houses, and the neighborhood where my friend lived. The valley dipped down in the middle with a steep incline surrounding it, and so at first, I had to go down into the valley, and then at the end, I would walk up out of the valley, exiting the tree line right onto the street where his house is. Once exiting the tree line, one would be standing on the side of the street with the end of the road about half a mile to your right and the entrance to the neighborhood about the same distance on the left. The houses were spaced apart decently, so the night was very dark except for the area around the houses and a couple of light circles under the orange streetlights, of which there were very few for the amount of space. I got through the valley with no problem this time, and I got up some speed to go up the hill in front of me where the forest ended maybe 5 feet from the edge of the street if the event was that far. At the exact moment, I came out of the tree line and onto the edge of the road, something caught my eye to the left of me emerging from the woods across the street. It stumbled awkwardly out of the dark woods and into view right at the edge of the circle of orange light radiating down from one of the streetlights. At first and for just a brief moment it looked like a shadow. However, I heard a sound coming from the dead leaves beneath its feet, and I quickly realized that it was not a shadow. Its body shape was like that of a starving child, maybe 3 feet tall, that you might see in a third world country, but its legs and arms were so thin that there appeared to be no way it could support the creature's body weight. It was dark, but from what I can remember at the ends of its frail-looking limbs were just nubs. No hands and no feet that I saw. Its movements were the creepiest part, honestly, and they were the first thing that threw me off. I can't even really explain how absurd and unnatural its movements were or how it was standing on those tiny legs. It moved forward from the trees and toward the street extremely awkwardly with the couple of steps that I saw it take. It was almost as if it was not supposed to be walking around like that, but it had somehow figured out a way to do so regardless. The thing was roughly 2 or 3 feet tall with an enlarged light bulb-shaped head and a little belly despite how thin the rest of its frame was. In addition to its shape and motion, the thing seemed unreal mostly because it didn't seem to reflect any light at all when it stepped into the light of the street lamp. It appeared to have no three-dimensional form at all, with its body almost blending right into its shadow, and I could only really tell it had solid form by the way that it moved and navigated the environment around it. I froze in place instantly when I saw it, with my brain unable to even process what I was seeing. In a couple of steps, It exited the trees, stumbled across the patch of grass to the street, and then sort of fumbled down forward toward a sewer drain on the side of the road. I'm not sure what I did, if anything, but as soon as it hit the curb, it rose back up and looked over at me. I couldn't see its face or anything at all, still just this bizarre black shape moving so unbelievably awkwardly. I really can't stress this enough. Its movements were ridiculously uncoordinated. What happened next is what sent me fleeing into the woods with all of the cowardice that has kept me alive to this day. Upon seeing me, this malformed shadow child thing did this quick twisted turn toward me, dropping down to all fours and becoming a much more animal-like shape when it did. I again have no idea how to describe the motion, as it was so unnatural, but when its turn was complete, the thing had become something I can only describe as a shadow dog or cat or bear. I know that sounds crazy, but I can't describe it any other way than that. It stood on all fours like a predatory animal, but I couldn't make out any definition on it with the way it didn't catch the light that it was standing directly below. This thing didn't just go from being human-like to being a human on all fours. I mean, it genuinely became something else as far as I can tell. I debated leaving this next part out because it just slices into the credibility of the events even further. But it happened, and so here it goes. As soon as the creature had hit all fours and was no longer humanoid, its eyes flashed yellow at me, and it let out a loud shriek, not a growl, not a bark, not a snarl, not an animal-like roar, or even a hissing, but a legitimate shriek that sounded like neither a person nor an animal. The sound started quietly, then rose quickly, almost as if it was winding up or under pressure and had just painfully been forced out of the creature's mouth in great anguish. Its scream had a certain harshness to it, as if it might have had something seriously wrong with its vocal cords, or it had just smoked a million cigarettes consecutively. I remember the thing had a weird, almost scared vulnerability to the sound it made, which contrasted the harshness and tone as well as the defensive stance the creature took. All this took place in just a few seconds, maybe 10 at most, from the time the thing exited the tree line to the time it turned, postured, shrieked at me, and sent me running without a single thought in my head right back into the woods. I did not stop. I did not look back. I did not try to be quiet through the forest. I just ran as fast as I could. That is correct. I was so scared I ran back into the dark, scary woods to get away, only realizing how dumb that was some time afterward. The sound it made chilled me to my core then, but now in hindsight, I think the flashing eyes bother me more than the sound because it seems so expected. The flashing or glowing eyes trope is precisely what I have heard in so many other people's stories I never believed about mysterious creatures they claim to have encountered. I mean, because that is what scary things in the night do, right? They flash yellow eyes and make a scary shrieking sound at you, obviously. What else would they do? I never made it to my friend's house that night, and I never mentioned this to anyone ever since. I managed to forget about this experience pretty quickly though. I'm not sure how my life was high drama at the time, so I'm sure it is because I did something stupid and that took over my world. 2. Second sighting, Central Florida, 2006 spring, I believe, early night, 8 p.m. The second sighting is much briefer, and as I mentioned before, I am 90% sure it was the same thing, but I'm not entirely sure. I'll keep this short and tell you simply that I was out camping, went for a walk along a trail, and watched my girlfriend hop from rock to rock across the river. I heard a sound to my left, and when I turned to look, I saw an extremely thin, skinny black nubbed leg, possibly a tail, disappear behind a tree as if an animal running away from something. I ran over this time, but I found nothing and I didn't mention it to my girlfriend. No experiences or weird sounds that night and no more encounters for several years. If you like more detail about this one, you can attempt to email me with any questions and I will try to remember. 3. Third sighting, Eastern Shore of Virginia, June 8, 2019, late night, 11 p.m. Well, finally here it is, the reason I felt I had to put this out there and the reason I am so freaked out by this thing. It's not so much what happened last week as it was another quick glimpse and nothing else, but instead, It is the fact that it happened again to me, and as far as I know, no one else. Last week I was at a party at a friend's house celebrating her birthday because she is one of those people in their 30s that still gets excited about those things. I don't drink, so I was not drunk, but, in the interest of total transparency, I have been known to partake in the occasional medicinal herbal supplement for recreational purposes. You can take that information however you like. My friend lives with her husband in a farmhouse surrounded by open fields for a couple of acres in any direction, surrounded of course by a thick forest. I had been there for a while, and the thing was the furthest thing from my mind. We were all just hanging out and rambling on about the usual inane bullshit. I decided that I wanted a smoke, and so I went out the front door and onto the porch. I stepped forward and went to step down the front steps to get a little more space, and as I did, I glanced up and out into the field in front of the house. There it was, roughly 50 yards out and bumbling through the field toward the trees. For a split second, I could see the unmistakable shape of this weird shadow child thing. It was just the same as before. Large head and belly, unbelievably thin arms and legs, and again reflecting absolutely no light at all. I was mid-step when I glanced up and lost track of where I was stepping, causing me to fall forward. I managed to catch myself as I fell barely, and I must have made a sound when I did it, because when I looked back up the thing was on all fours, quickly running like a dog off into the woods. I reiterate, this thing did not move on all fours like a person in any way, but it moved like an animal with knees bent backward. I was too far away, and it happened too fast for me to tell if it had hands and feet this time. I started to walk out and look around a bit when someone came outside, and not wanting to tell anyone, I just went back to the party. I must have been distant the rest of the night because I couldn't get it out of my head this time. I ended up leaving the party relatively early and went home to start obsessing about it, as I have been, for about a week now. So I am sufficiently freaked out by a lot of things about what I have seen. Even discounting the second sighting, I got 2 brief but good looks at something that I cannot explain. One of the things that bothers me the most about this is, why me? Why, as far as I know, have I been the only one to see this thing? If it knows of me and is following me or something like that, then why does it seem surprised by my presence each time I've seen it and then enter a sort of fight or flight mentality? If it doesn't know of me, then why am I the only one to see this thing, and now in 3 different states years apart? I have so many questions. I'm writing this over a few days to make sure I have got all the details as best as I can remember, and I hope I'm not the only one that saw this creepy thing. What I saw that night was so unnatural. I never expected to see anything like it in my life. It honestly just did not belong in our physical reality, and it almost did not even seem to fit in the environment around it, as if it was something 2D superimposed into an authentic 3D background. I looked into shadow people videos and sightings, but I don't think this was that, as there was nothing ghostly about what I saw. It was there and had solid form. It was so out of place, but at the same time I saw it there and heard it as well. I don't know what else to say about it. Each time, except the second, I could see enough of it that I could tell it was not somebody messing with me, and I could see enough of it to say it did not belong here in this world with us. My best guess at this point is that it and I crossed each other's paths in a possible interdimensional rift or time slip, only because of how surreal the experience was. I know that sounds crazy, but it is all I have come up with to rationalize the fact that this thing did not fit into its surroundings in any way. It did not even look like it was made to move and get around in this world. The force of gravity should have for sure crushed its skinny legs under the weight of its body. It was like an eggplant on toothpicks. That is all that it is for me to tell, but I sincerely hope someone else saw something like this, so I know I am not starting to lose it. At this point, I only want to know that I am not alone and that what I saw has some explanation, rational or not. I don't even care, please. Just give me something to go on. I need one reasonable answer from somewhere at this point, because I know what I saw, and I can't get the way this thing moved or how dark it was out of my head. During my spring break of 1977, my family and 3 other families from the neighborhood I grew up in traveled to a Holiday Inn in Navarre Beach. My mother had told me it was a newly opened hotel. It had an indoor pool, arcade, gift shop, deli, and small movie theater. For its day, it was considered to be a very nice place, and my family went to this hotel 3 times. During our second visit in August of 1977, the film Jaws 2 was being filmed at Navarre, and I even got to see the mechanical Jaws stored with other movie equipment and props in the eastern portion of the hotel parking lot. During this spring break vacation around late March of 1977, there was a special showing of the film Bugsy Malone, which only children were permitted to attend. It was during the film that I started to feel a bit disoriented. I heard some other children crying, and I heard the sound of someone throwing up. At one point in the film, I got up from my chair to leave, but I was quickly escorted back to my chair by an usher in a black suit and black hat. I saw 1 or maybe 2 more men in black suits at the back of the theater. After the film was over, I felt just fine, and I never did complain to anyone about that experience. One evening on this vacation, I awoke and sat up in my bed. I looked across the room and could see a group of small figures in the dimly lit room. My brother was asleep to my right, and my parents were asleep in the bed to my left. The feeling I felt was something I had felt before, which I immediately recognized. It was a feeling I only felt when the Greys were near. I thought, it's been a while. And to a young boy about to turn 7, it had been over 2 years since his last encounter with the Greys. So it had felt like a long time. But then I could not move, and one of the figures moved towards me very fast, and the last thing I recalled was its big black eyes very close to my face and a wand-like object being pointed at me. Then there was blackness. The next thing I recall was being in the sand dunes away from the hotel in a circle of children. I must have been one of the youngest because I was the shortest. But my attention was more on the blue object directly over us that had a glowing blue light all about it. The closest thing I've seen to this shade of blue would be that of the blue glow of Cherenkov radiation that I've only seen in photos. Then there was blackness. The next morning was a Saturday, and I was watching cartoons. It was not till I was watching TV that I recalled that night's experience with the Greys and seeing the blue glowing sphere above me and the other children. I then told one of the other children who were traveling with us on this trip about my experience that night, and she did not believe me. I also recall walking around the hotel later that day and then getting up the nerve to tell my older brother, who also teased me.
Story time.
Last year, in Fairbanks, Alaska, I was heading south on Auburn Drive towards Farmers Loop, which was about a mile away. It was a wooded area frequently visited by homes and, in general, considered a populated area. The houses were, on average, about 100 to 200 feet apart, with only the immediate vicinity around the homes cleared out. Most of the area was densely wooded. This section of the road passed by Pearl Creek Elementary School, and you could catch glimpses of the school through the woods. Some parts of the woods in the area were quite thick, making it difficult to see beyond about 10 or 15 feet. However, in this particular area, it had seemingly been cleared out quite a bit, allowing for open sight lines into the sections of the woods. You could see the school and a vegetable garden off to the right from the road. It was around 6 p.m., and I was heading home after a day of working on a deck that I was building. The weather was clear, with the sun high in the sky. As I was driving, I happened to notice a man standing by the right side of the road about 100 yards ahead. It was more of an unconscious recognition, as there was nothing unusual about a man standing on the side of the road in this area. As I got within about 50 yards, I looked closer and said to myself, "That's no man." Shortly after that, in a second or two, he bolted into the woods toward the school, moving like a wild animal would when spooked. I didn't slow down until I reached the spot where I had seen him enter the woods, and that's where I stopped. I could see him running away from the road, and when he was about 30 yards into the woods, he turned left, running parallel to the road in the same direction I was heading. I got a good look at him, but I couldn't see his face. I might have seen it if I hadn't been so mesmerized and had the presence of mind to look at it. I was preoccupied with other details. His fur or hair looked to be about 3 to 4 inches long all over the main part of his body. It was a reddish, rusty color, and I was mildly struck by how red it was, but it definitely had a rustiness to it. He was about 6 feet tall and appeared to weigh around 200 pounds. He had a peculiar, hoppy kind of run. It wasn't a limp with one foot. The foot he pushed off with was more pronounced than a normal running motion. The other foot he pushed off with propelled him upward about a foot or less and forward. I watched him until he disappeared into the woods. There was a road about 100 yards ahead, and I headed towards it, turning right and then right again, leading to the road that led to the school parking lot. The wooded area he was in seemed like a peninsula, so he had to be in there somewhere. The woods I was looking into from that angle were quite thick, and I didn't see him. I haven't seen him since. A little farther up on the right was the school garden, which had people in it around 7 to 10. In hindsight, I regret not stopping to talk to them about it. The next day, as I was driving to work on the deck, I naturally slowed down in the area. I stopped and surveyed the area when I saw a couple walking their dogs approaching. I flagged them down and shared the story of what happened the evening before. They told me that about a week ago, they were there with their dogs, on their way to the other side of the school property by the soccer field when 3 kids came running over to them, asking, "Did you see Sasquatch?" They also mentioned that what appeared to be a dad was with them, who didn't seem excited about it. In conclusion, whether it was real or not, I can only say that it was either a genuine encounter or a person in an incredibly convincing costume. I reported it to the Fish and Game office in Fairbanks a couple of days later. The person taking the report seemed to be somewhat skeptical, but I insisted he take my phone number just in case. I was driving my girlfriend home from work. Both of us lived in a suburb of our small town, so the drive from her workplace is relatively short. The only off thing about our encounter was the fact we saw it in a suburb, as opposed to the wooded or rural areas, like other encounters. The moon was full, so we had a lot of light to see, but there were many mature trees in the yards of the houses surrounding the road we were driving on. All we saw was a large black blur, moving very fast. Almost as fast as a greyhound, at full speed. The length of the blur made me estimate it to be 6 to 7 feet. Both of us were shaken by the experience and headed home immediately. When we got home, my girlfriend and I recanted our experience with her family, who laughed at us for telling them we had seen such a thing. They brushed it off as a tall tale and went on with their nightly activities. My girlfriend's 2 younger siblings were planning on playing a game called Manhunt. It's pretty much just like hide and seek. When the 2 of them headed out, not even 2 minutes after they walked out the door, they both bolted in, clearly upset and shaken. They both said they saw exactly what my girlfriend and I saw, but when they saw it, it was walking on its hind legs, under a street lamp. Because of that, they got a clear view of it. They said it was dog-like and was walking on its hind legs, on the street. After hearing that, we all as a group of witnesses, headed out in my car, to search for the beast and to warn the other kids playing Manhunt about the beast. My girlfriend's siblings have stopped playing Manhunt after their experience, and now that we all have a name to what we saw, we are all more shaken wondering if it will be back. I personally did not see it, but a non-commissioned officer I work with, along with his wife, child, and hunting buddy, were on their way home. According to them, a large, hairy, approximately 7-foot tall ape-like creature crossed the road in front of them. From what I could gather, none of them are familiar with Bigfoot information. Anyway, they say it crossed the road, which is about 35 feet in width, in 4 to 5 steps. It seemed to disappear into the brush on the other side, which leads to a river called the Chenna. Both of the guys have been hunting since childhood and are confident they can recognize a bear when they see one. The creature crossed the road on its hind legs, and as we all agreed, yes, a bear can raise up on its hind legs and even take a few clumsy steps. However, crossing a 35-foot road? No way. They said they even came back later to look for tracks. He wasn't too sure, but he said he found some tracks that didn't look like any tracks he was familiar with. They were pointed inwards, like a person who is what I call pigeon-toed. They heard or saw nothing else but were a bit shaken and headed home. The entire story seemed incredible to me because the incident took place on a military installation. I really don't want to get the guys involved because they fear ridicule. I'd like to tell you about the encounter my son had, maybe 4 years ago. He told me about it then, but I had no clue. Now we have dog-man encounters and now I know. Here's what happened. My son's friend was driving him home, about 11 p.m., through a rural, residential area. The houses are spaced some distance apart. They were on a 2-lane highway, with no street lights, and very little traffic. The area is not overly wooded, but has patches of trees and fields. This area would probably be included in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains. Anyway, they were driving along, when suddenly, from the right side of the road, this thing sprang out, and was across the road, and into the bushes on the other side, in 2 leaps, or bounds, or steps, or however you want to say it. It was in full view, because of their headlights. My son said the first thing he thought was dog. He went on to say that it was running on all 4s, like a deer. He said it was the color of a deer, with a huge dog head, massive shoulders, and a really small waist. He kept repeating how big it was, so I asked for a comparison. I asked if he meant huge like maybe a big deer or was it maybe as tall as a cow. He answered and I can quote his answer, "Mom, this thing was massive. If we had hit it, the car would have gone underneath it and its body would have hit the windshield." I don't remember what kind of car it was, but it was about the size and shape of one of those older Sentras. He said that neither he or his friend said anything for about 10 seconds and then his friend yelled, "Did you see that?" My son said yes and they didn't say another word the rest of the way. And that's it. It's really creepy to me and I thought other listeners might to hear about it. This happened in late August of '97 in a side valley of Goldstream Valley, a relatively populated area just north of Fairbanks. Although it's quite close to the Fairbanks area with many houses and roads in the main part of Goldstream, the side valleys are still as wild as they were 1,000 years ago. I was hunting ruffed grouse in one of these side valleys, and I prefer not to disclose which one. I was on a south-facing aspen-covered hillside and had been hunting all afternoon and evening, intending to spend the night out on the hill and hunt my way back in the morning. As I was making camp, a black bear almost walked right into me. I heard him coming from a distance and scared him away before he got closer. Later on, it will become apparent why I mentioned this. So, I was sleeping out in the open, without a tent, under a spruce tree. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was awakened by something crawling around my camp, maybe 30 feet or so away from me, walking in the circle I mentioned earlier. The bear I mentioned before wasn't the source of these sounds. My father is a hunting guide, and I literally grew up hunting bears, so I know what a bear sounds like when it's walking. Whatever this thing was, it was walking on 2 legs with a bit of a shuffling sound between each step, as if it was dragging its feet just a bit. The leaves on the forest floor were dried, like potato chips, and it was breaking a lot of branches. I could hear it and follow its movements quite distinctly. I have to say that I've spent a lot of time here in the Alaskan bush and have never before or since been truly afraid of anything I've encountered. But I don't mind saying that on that particular night, I was literally shaking with fear. It, or whatever it was, circled my camp for what seemed like hours, but it was probably only 5 or so minutes. Finally, Remembering something I once read about Indian beliefs regarding woodsmen, I started talking to it, albeit in a shaky voice, saying I wanted no trouble that night. The thing stopped dead in its tracks, and then a few moments later, I heard it trotting downhill away from me. Talking to such a creature may sound kind of cornball, but all I know is that it works. I've kicked myself for this many times since, but the next morning, I didn't bother to look for any tracks, hair, or evidence. I just packed up and resumed my hunting. I had no further trouble with the woodsman. As a final couple of notes, I do recall hearing a kind of low muttering sound as it was prowling around. Also, having since done some reading on Bigfoot sightings, I've noticed that a lot of people reported the animal having a strong, foul odor. However, I did not smell any particular odor, foul or otherwise. Most of the native peoples of Alaska seem to have stories about the woodsman, the bushman, or even the hairy man. Other than this, I've never heard of anyone I know having an actual encounter with a woodsman in Alaska. This incident occurred in June 2019 while I was still living in Nashville, Tennessee. My school had let out and I was staying at a friend, which between friends and me I'd drop off my stuff and then wander the neighborhood late at night because I couldn't sleep. Now don't get me wrong, I've had plenty of strange things happen to me on my night walks, from the homeless offering me a duck to being followed by a car of drunk guys, but this one was different. One night I saw two figures come out of the woods. They looked smaller and younger than me and I was instantly curious. I followed the kids, staying quiet, when suddenly the little girl, she seemed to be younger than the boy, stood in the middle of the road. Of course, I bolt out and tackle her as a car comes, the thing nearly missing both of us. When I looked down, the little girl was more annoyed than happy or grateful. What got my attention was the black eyes. It was like starting into a void. I couldn't look away. As soon as I looked into them, I felt a rush of fear so strong that it overwhelmed everything. I still don't know how long that it lasted or if anything happened, but the next thing I knew, the boy was ripping me off the girl with surprising strength. By now I was completely freaked. I couldn't bring myself to check his eyes. Doing what I felt best, I literally slipped his grip and took off sprinting. I could hear them running after me, yelling for me to wait, to stop, and I don't know why, but I almost did. I ended up sprinting through backyards until I couldn't hear them, before going to my friends. She's the one who told me of black-eyed kids. I'm not crazy. I know it really happened. I was rabbit hunting between the hours of 21:30 CDT to about 23:15 CDT on a farm outside of Maud, Oklahoma. It was a clear and cold night with a quarter moon out. I was armed with a pump-action tactical shotgun and a Kimber 5" .45 California pistol, along with about 100 rounds of .45 and .45 shotgun rounds. Both weapons are equipped with high-end white lights. Upon returning to my home, at about 23:15 CDT, I walked up on my patio, which is about 5 feet off the ground. I saw a large human-like figure that was bigger than any man I ever saw. I used the Surefire white light on my shotgun to see better. Due to light fog, I could only see about 25 feet with the light. The creature was out in the open enough to see an outline of the figure. I had seen all my animals act unusual prior, a feeling of being watched at hours of darkness more than once. The figure was watching me and made eye contact. It was very large and close to 7 to 8 feet tall, was a very stocky build, would guess over 400 pounds. The figure seemed annoyed that I pointed my shotgun at it. It seemed to have no fear of me or my animals. My dog, military trained, cowered down and would not respond to commands. I did contact a Bigfoot team that showed up within 72 hours of this. No evidence was found. No footprints, hair, nothing. I did experience some lapses in memory thereafter. I am a retired Special Forces sniper with 10 years of experience and 3 tours in Iraq, including the Iraq invasion with the 3rd Inf. Division on the front lines. I have no knowledge after all I have seen and done to describe this figure. I do need to be kept out of any public report because of my background and security clearance with the military. I just want answers and will provide full cooperation in person. The biggest thing that bothers me is the lack of fear from the figure and my fear back. I fear very little in life. Just want to get to the bottom of this. Just found your YouTube channel and listen with interest the story on Ben McDewey and the feeling of a spectral being. I had exactly the same on that mountain 23 years ago. I was walking or mountain biking with a friend in Scotland and decided to park at Keok Water and cycle or climb up to the cairn on Ben McDewey. It was a bright May day when we left on mountain bikes to go to the tops, and that point we had no idea that day would leave a lasting impression on me, and until I came across your site I thought we were the only ones to have had such an encounter. It took some hours crossing small streams and hillocks before we came to the foothills of Ben McDewey. We cycled and pushed the bikes as far up the mountain as we could, and then decided to leave the bikes and make our way up to the cairn as quickly as possible, as it was quite late in the day. We pushed on up in glorious weather. It wasn't bright sunlight, but it also wasn't murky, dismal, or really overcast. It was extremely cold, but we were wrapped up warm. The views were fantastic. On reaching the cairn we decided to have a small snack to aid our return journey, and whilst we sat at the cairn I heard a call and looked over to see a golden eagle performing twists and turns. It was everything you could ever want to see in Scotland: beautiful views from the top, and a golden eagle, more than we could ever have wished for. We were ecstatic and on a high. Finishing our snack of Mars bars and bananas, we decided to get ready for the hike back to the bikes and the long journey back to the car. It was here that the atmosphere changed, and not for the better. From being on high, all of a sudden we'd be aware of a heavy atmosphere that had descended upon us for no disconcerted reason. We turned for home and started to walk, and I had the uncanny feeling something was following us. It was a feeling of real dread. I kept looking behind me, but there was nothing there. At the same time, I heard footsteps following us, keeping just behind me. We walked a little faster, and then I stopped suddenly, and lo and behold, there came from nowhere two distinct footsteps that stopped directly behind me. I was too terrified to look, as I had an uncanny feeling that whatever was causing this feeling was huge. I cannot explain why I had the mental impression that this entity was a giant. Now this will sound silly, but I had the impression of a giant ape-like man. I am not saying Bigfoot, Alma, or Sasquatch, but that was the impression I was given. At this point, I took off with my friend at a rate of knots that was dangerous to do because of the shale underfoot. But we didn't care. The faster we ran, the more the feeling of dread came over us, as if it was giving chase. It wasn't until we reached the bikes and rode off that the feeling started to dissipate. I was physically shaking and had no wish to ever return to that mountain. Thanks to your site, I now know after all these years I wasn't going mad, thank goodness. It was 1969, I was on patrol one evening, just before dark in the North 2 Corp in North Vietnam. We were returning to the hill when we encountered hostile fire. The squad was caught off guard, so we used what cover was available. The fight had been going on for only a few minutes when movement caught my eye. Through the thick vegetation, I saw what I thought was a large man breaking cover from behind my left side. As the thing ran past me, I realized it wasn't a man, and was not really sure of what I was seeing. The thing was about 7 feet tall and had an enormous build, though not completely covered with hair. The thing had reddish-brown hair covering a good portion of its body. It had covered about 30 yards, very quickly passing within just yards of my position, when it got hit in the crossfire. The thing stumbled once or twice but never fell. All of a sudden the enemy broke and ran. One even left his weapon behind. They were yelling something, but none of us ever knew what it was they were yelling. We slowly regrouped and made sure no one was wounded and discussed what we thought we had seen. As it was getting dark and there were hostiles in the area, we decided to get back to the hill. That night we heard several howls sounding very similar to the ones that you have recorded, coming from all over the place. Some sounded like they were just outside of the hooch and others sounded more than a mile away. There were all kinds of sounds from whines to growls to sounds that sounded like barks. Needless to say, no one slept very well that night. The next morning, all of us that were on that patrol decided to try to track this thing. It took a lot of talking to get Tops to let us go looking for it, but after hearing the same story from the whole squad, he decided to let us have a chance to bring it back. We returned to the area and found a blood trail leading into the jungle. We trailed it for quite some time when we found the body of an enemy soldier that had been almost entirely torn apart. We do not know exactly what happened, but I have a good notion to what may have happened. We basically ran out of the area back to our hill. The rest of the time we were in Vietnam, I never heard the sounds or saw anything like it again. The talk of what we had seen spread very quickly, and some of the locals called it a name that I can neither pronounce nor remember. But the translation, if I recall, was stench monkey or foul monkey, something like that. I can't remember for sure. What I do know is that it bothered me so much that I transferred from there to a job on a helicopter so that I wouldn't have to be in the jungle anymore. After returning home to Alabama when my tour had ended, I occasionally heard sounds that reminded me so much of that encounter. It had been years since I left Alabama and moved to West Central Illinois. I seldom thought of that day in Vietnam or the things I heard and saw. The recording is exactly what I had heard over there. I could close my eyes and still hear the howl in Vietnam. Regrettably, I have mixed feelings about discovering your website, relieved that someone else may now know what I went through, frightened that there may be something in the area of where I now live. I realize that you are interested in pursuing this creature or one like it. But let me warn you from someone who has seen what it is capable of firsthand. Don't. First, I want you to know that the story I'm going to share with you is 100% true. It is based on my account of an event that has significantly impacted the way I view the world around me. As humans, we take comfort in the known, and are often fearful or skeptical of phenomenon or entities that we don't understand. Of course, there's many people out there, myself included, who thoroughly enjoy questioning subjects beyond human comprehension. But alas, we are a minority, often lumped into a cynical category of conspiracy nut jobs. I'm not writing this story to change what you believe, but rather, to share with you what I now know to be truth. I have followed countless subreddits over the past few years, but this is my first time making an account, specifically for the purpose of posting this story. Disregard the silly account name, my sense of humor will surely be my end of days. For now, let us acquaint ourselves with the eager experience that dwells within me, yearning at its chance to finally be known by unfamiliar souls. I am the oldest of 2 children, in a family of 4. As I write this, my mother and father are both 50, my younger sister, 20, and myself, 23. My father recently retired from 29 years of military service in the U.S. Army. Naturally, as is common in military families, I've seen my fair share of the world. We've been stationed everywhere from Georgia and Italy, to Washington and Texas. Although I was born in Hawaii, and am currently living there again, I always consider Washington State to be the place where I really grew up, so to speak. I lived there from 5th grade to 11th grade, years that were crucial in my transition from boy to man. The Pacific Northwest, as stunningly beautiful as any place on earth could possibly be, brought with it its fair share of curiosities. Many of you might know that the area is particularly famous for UFO sightings and Bigfoot sightings. Being the young child that I was upon my arrival, I took an interest in the unknown. Every week I was at the library with my mom, renting books about alien abductions, ghosts, yetis, Bigfoot, UFOs, crop circles, the Bermuda Triangle, demonic possession, and a myriad of other phenomenon that commanded my attention. I include this information because it will be critical to the story later on. I will say for now that for my readings, I was pretty knowledgeable of what Bigfoot evidence consisted of. I had read many stories and reports of the infamous stench they carry, the loud shrieking cries they make, and many other signs of their presence. It is because of this beforehand knowledge that I remember some of the small details of my account. Had I not understood the traits that people have attributed to Bigfoot, many of the small details in my account would probably have slipped through the cracks. Now let us visit the day of the event. That day I have kept quiet of for far too long. I was 13 years old at the time, and in the 7th grade, so that puts us back in the year 2005. The spring season was coming to an end around this time, and in Washington, spring and summer are the only times one gets to enjoy the sun. Throughout fall and winter it's pretty much just heavy rain, day in and day out. Summers were notorious for thunderstorms though. It wasn't uncommon to wake up drenched in sweat and go to bed drenched in rain. Weather patterns in Washington state are the very definition of unpredictable. On this particular summer day, it was Saturday, and my father and I decided to go fishing. We usually go fishing twice a month, and we usually go to the same spot to do so, a massive lake surrounded by dense forestry, located only a few miles away from an Indian reservation. It was a beautiful lake and we loved being surrounded by all the trees and wildlife, with no cities or major roads nearby. It made for nice, peaceful bonding experiences with my father. He had just returned from his first 365-day deployment to Iraq, so I was eager to finally spend a day with my old man again. The lake itself was surrounded by forest, with the region to the west running out into the Pacific Ocean or Puget Sound. The region to the north led to the Indian reservation. To the east was a small town primarily consisting of Native Americans. Many of them from the reservation had set up shops in this nearby town. And to the south was the interstate that took you back to, well, civilization. With the exception of the occasional fellow fisherman strolling by, the lake was always desolate and eerily silent. After arriving to our usual fishing hole, and unloading all of the poles, lures, and tackle boxes from the back of the Toyota pickup truck my dad drove, I don't remember the model or year, everything was business as usual. The sun was out, it was about 1 p.m., and my father kept sharing stories of his experiences in Iraq while I continued to eagerly beg for more. We casted our lines, exchanged words, chewed some sunflower seeds, spit out the shells, reeled in the lines, and then moved on to a different story before recasting and repeating the whole process. I loved it. It was a ritual only he and I fully appreciated the sentimentality of. Minutes turn to hours and before we know it, it's about 5:30 in the evening. We decide to pack it in because nightfall in that part of the state could arrive as early as 6 to 6:30, and we didn't want to be in the forest at night time, primarily because of bears and wolves. Keep in mind, however, that it is still currently bright out and the sun has only just began to make its descent beyond the mountains. With more than enough daylight to pack up, my father starts reeling in all of the casts and breaking down the poles. I packed up the tackle boxes and lures and threw them into the pickup bed along with the coolers and snacks we had packed. The poles were the only things left to be loaded up, and then we would be ready to leave. I was about to tell my father that I was going to go take a piss real quick, and before I could even open my mouth, I caught a whiff of a smell that I can still remember clearly to this day. It was rancid. That's the best way to describe the stench, absolutely rancid. I have never smelled anything so terrible in my life. Do you smell that? I called out. What? Replied my father. I figured it must have just been something blowing through in the breeze. Never mind. It smelled like a wet dog rolled around in its own shit, got hit by a truck, lie dead under a hot sun for 2 weeks, and then burst into some kind of maggot-infested stench cloud. And that's just putting it politely. The odor stung my eyes. Dad, I'm gonna go pee real quick, I'll be back. He nodded and off I went, into the shrubbery to our usual piss spot. Oftentimes we will just pee anywhere, but because we had seen a few fishermen walk by a couple hours ago, I figured it'd be safer to just go piss in the trees. We usually piss behind this massive fallen tree that's roughly 50 yards into the woods. It's leaned at a perfect angle that provides total obscurity from the lake's side. The forest itself is thick enough to probably conceal me without the aid of the fallen tree, but somehow pissing behind this tree just became habit during the many visits we have made to this fishing hole in the past. As I'm pissing, the sky was suddenly enveloped in clouds in a matter of seconds. It was bizarre. There was still daylight, but it was more gray and toned down, as opposed to the sunlight you would get with a clear blue sky. It reminded me of a winter day, when the sun's presence seems completely absent. Then everything happened so fast. As I'm zipping up, I hear a tremendously loud crack right behind me, I'd say about 30 yards away based on its reverb. As I'm in the middle of turning around, my face is sprinkled with the light droplets that precede a heavy thunderstorm. I scan the area where I heard the sound but see nothing. My immediate thought was that it was an old tree branch splitting off, which is common to hear in these woods. CR crack. I hear it again, closer, but from a different direction. I would be a liar if I told you my heart wasn't racing like a mother F at this point. I could easily have just ran back to the fishing hole, but curiosity kept my feet glued. It was like knowing what made that sound was a prerequisite to concluding our fishing trip. After about 2 minutes of me standing there foolishly, and realizing that I'm getting drenched in the rain that is beginning to pick up, I chalk the noise up to thunder and turn around to head back to my father. Part of me was in denial though. It wasn't a boom sound like thunder, this was a crack, like something big was being snapped in half. I took about 3 steps in the direction of the fishing hole when I heard the most bone-chilling sound that I have ever heard to this day. Ie. It sounded like a cross between a man screaming on top of his lungs, and, well, another man screaming on top of his lungs. I know that might seem silly, but that's really how I remember it. It sounded like 2 men screaming in unison, with slightly different pitches in their voice. I didn't have time to think about where that dreaded noise came from. My ass was in high gear. I remember shortly after that noise from hell, I heard my father shout my name with obvious worry in his voice. I know he heard the sound as well, and probably thought it was me screaming, or thought it was an animal or something. As I'm sprinting to the direction of the truck and making every effort to control my body's shaking, adrenaline is a bitch, while jumping over branches and logs and maneuvering between foliage, I suddenly hear crunch 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 crunch. Something is walking through the woods, very close to me. Dad, was all I could manage to get out in between short breaths. And holy shit, I see it. I see it. I see it. While sprinting forward, I see a dark mass in the far left of my field of vision growing. Everything was a blur, so I just assumed everything in the corner of my eyes was bushes, trees, etc. And then I realized this isn't an immobile object that's growing, this is something that's coming closer to me, getting bigger as the distance between us closes. Suddenly it hit me that this approaching object was the source of the crunch crunch crunch, so I turned my head to the left and what I saw accelerated me to speeds that I would think are humanly impossible. Approaching me with tremendous speed was an ape-like creature with massive swinging arms. Those I remember the most. The arms were massive and long, almost lanky in the way they dangled, but very muscular. This creature was bipedal as all hell. You know how when you go to the zoo, you see monkeys and gorillas walking around with some assistance of their forearms? Kind of like tromping around on all fours, but occasionally using just 2 feet before leaning back onto all fours? Yay, not this thing. This creature was full-on striding towards me with its legs, while its arms swang lazily at its sides. My biggest fear was that all it had to do was reach out to grab me because its arms seemed long enough to do that. This thing was so close to me and all I could focus on was going faster and faster and faster. I recall the awful smell being present again. It was in full force, just the worst stench anything on this planet could produce. I was too scared to care, but I definitely remember the smell being heavy. The final details I can recall from my brief glimpse at this demon of the woodlands was that it was easily about 7 to 8 feet tall and matted with thick brown fur. Very long fur too. Its head was conical in shape. It seemed to narrow at the top, but from head to toe, this thing was matted in very long brown hair. I remember seeing bits of leaf and foliage stuck throughout the fur on its body too. I didn't dare try and make out facial details, although sometimes I wish I had. I couldn't see much of the face from my distance combined with my constant running, and at the time, I really didn't want to know what the F this thing looked like. Its body gave me more than enough fear for a lifetime. By this point, the rain is coming down heavy and I kept telling myself in my head, please don't slip, please don't slip, please don't slip. God. I must have screamed that about 1,000 times. I remember making a few attempts to scream but nothing would come out because my throat was very raw and sore from the screaming I was already doing. I also remember thinking, why does it feel like he's, my dad, so far away? The walk to the piss spot is a short one and yet I swear I was running full speed for a good few minutes before I made it back. Fear does incredible things to your sense of time and space. As I approach the clearing and can make out the pickup truck, by some incredible grace of parental intuition, my dad pulls some very genius shit. I'm not sure what prompted him to do this, but as I'm approaching the fishing hole, I see him standing by the edge of the wood line, looking for me through the foliage. His truck is already on and running, his driver's side door is open, and he's close to it, as if he knew that whatever was happening to me was going to involve a much-needed quick escape. The truck was parked in a way where the driver's side was already facing the wood line I'm running out of, so I like to think we were dealt a good hand on this day. At the very moment we made eye contact, my dad turns around and hauls ass for the driver's seat, but not before shouting, "Jump in the bed. Get in the back, hurry." I should note that this is only a 2-seater pickup, so my options were to circle around the truck and get in the passenger door, or to jump in the bed. It's obvious which option is far less time consuming. Crunch, crunch, crunch. All I can think about is how happy I'm gonna be to see the interstate again. Crunch, thud, thud. This thing is still following me and is now out of the woods and running on the dirt. Its footsteps are the only indicator of its presence while my visual focus is purely on what's ahead. I remember quickly eyeballing the best point on the ground to jump from to make it into the pickup bed smoothly. Thud, 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 and then another ie. The shriek happened just as I made my leap of faith, and I would even go as far as to say that it terrified me so much in a way that it made my jump even stronger. I jumped like my life depended on it. And no sooner than my body made contact with the bed of the truck, my dad floored it. I shifted violently around as he gunned from 0 to 60 miles per hour. I couldn't feel the vicious bruise my arm had taken when I landed on one of the tackle boxes. I couldn't feel the sharp ringing in my ear from the shriek of defeat the creature emitted. I couldn't feel the sting of the 2 fishing hooks that burrowed just beneath the skin of my right calf. I didn't care about anything. I only cared about going home. As I gathered myself and braced myself in the bed of the truck, I looked down the rapidly vanishing dirt path we had come from and caught only a glimpse of the creature's back, as it strode back into the dense foliage of the woodline. Rain was pouring down heavily, creating a light film of mist that eventually shrouded the remainder of the creature. Tall, built, hairy, and aggressive. It looked like its head was hung low or its shoulders were slouched. Its posture didn't seem as upright as it was when it was chasing me. Whatever this thing was, it was used to having its way, and today, we didn't grant him that. I remember grinning from ear to ear as we approached the first back road that lead through the small town to the east. Seeing a stop sign has never made me so happy in my life. It was more than just a stop sign. It was a sign of humanity. A sign that civilization was near. During the 30-minute drive to town, one thought kept racing through my mind. That was a friggin' Sasquatch. We stopped at a bait shop in the small Native American town which consisted of a few old wooden shops and some town folk who were bringing things inside and scurrying to cover up their belongings from the rainfall. We asked the owner of the shop if he had any band-aids and a sink we could use, since my leg was bleeding pretty heavily from the fish hooks. He looked like he was in his mid-30s, very smooth complexion, dark brown skin, and a long black ponytail running down his back. He was more than happy to help us after he saw my leg. He went into the back office and returned with a wet washcloth and some gauze, and was accompanied by an older man who looked like he was in his 60s, with brown wrinkled skin, and long gray hair, also in a ponytail. We explained the story to them while the older man was inspecting my wound, and after he removed the hooks and cleaned up the cut, he wrapped my leg firmly with gauze. Then the younger man spoke to us about how he has heard similar stories from that lake before about a large hairy creature who lurks in the woods. None of the people in town or from the reservation ever go near the lake, according to him. It's considered cursed grounds, and he explained to us some native ancestors who were buried there for various atrocities. I don't fully remember every fine detail he told us, but he definitely said that's an area that people avoid, which would explain why it seems like nobody is ever there. He said oftentimes, fishermen will come back from the lake and stop in town to get gas and share stories of seeing large beasts while they were down there. Some of them say they saw massive bears walking around like men. The older of the men asked us if we were familiar with the legend of Sasquatch, and my dad and I both said we were familiar with it and that it was our first guess when we saw the creature. I remember the old man just nodded his head, and went back into the office. Those were the only words he said. It creeped me out. It was as if he was silently confirming our suspicions. The younger man told us one last story about how there are tales that the Sasquatch causes thunderstorms. He summons rain because it somehow affects the patterns that fish appear in or something to that extent. I don't remember the specifics. But he noted that it was interesting that we were telling him the story of what just happened, when a thunderstorm had just picked up. Then I recalled that when I first heard the crack while peeing, the raindrops started to pour down and eventually became a thunderstorm. It gave me chills. After my wound was taken care of, we thanked the men and left the bait shop. My dad ran into the gas station and bought 2 beers for us. We sat in the parked truck and each drank our beer while holy shitting every detail of our encounter while nightfall slowly took over for the evening. Then after a good few minutes of speculating and thanking God that everything turned out fine, we got back on the interstate and headed home, rain coming down in sheets. We've told family and friends of our encounter, but nobody ever seems to fully understand what we went through on that summer day. How can they? It's a terror that must be felt to be understood. They didn't see what we saw, but that's okay. I wouldn't wish such a sight on my own worst enemy. I guess this experience has taught me 2 things. As humans, we are only a tiny speck in a world that is beyond our control. We can never truly know everything that is out there, and to those who remain skeptical of anything deemed an imperfection in the history of mankind, I must say, such a stance demands great ignorance. Oh, and also, just piss wherever the hell you want. While at an Army military police school, my brother-in-law, Craig Miles of Boise, Idaho, met a Vietnam veteran who recalled a low-altitude special forces drop in the interior during 1967-68. It was the middle of the night. There were no villages for 15 miles. For a period of 3 nights, they heard choking and gurgling noises. On the 4th day, they found the upper half of a decomposing Bigfoot-like creature. It had been blown in half by something. Not them. This was apparently not the noise they had heard. A mate possibly? This was the speculation that was circulating. They could see into the body cavity. Spine, lungs, and such. All was crawling with bugs. There was shorter hair on the huge head. The eyes sunk back 1.5 inches from the brow line. It had long arms. Very large and long fingers. One hand was still wrapped around a branch. He didn't say what color it was but did mention that it had a flat nose. If the creature had its legs, the estimated height was around 8 feet tall. There was no sign of the lower half of the body. They were able to see the teeth. All flat, well-formed molars, except the canines, which were longer and pointed. Seemed adapted to living in the forest with long arms and fingers, or perhaps just builds night nests like gorillas sometimes do. So, recently, my boyfriend of 2 years has told me a handful of times while I am talking to him, that my face changes. I know this because I'll be in the middle of a sentence and he will look at me very strange like I'm something else. And I will ask him what's wrong. In the past, I've made close friends and usually the people who are more spiritual will notice right away and tell me, but they can never describe it. I can remember at least 5 other individuals who have told me the same thing. Whenever I get close to someone on a more spiritual level, they all see someone else while looking at me in deep conversation or feeling towards each other. One person in particular who spoke Latin and practiced rituals, kicked me out while hanging out because it freaked him out. He called me Lilith and said I'm attached to something more. My boyfriend is not spiritual in any way. But when he's deep in his feels, it happens. Anyone else here like me? Anyone know what this could possibly be about? I am half Mexican, and in recent years, my mother and I have started participating in the Dia de Muertos tradition by creating our ofrenda and hanging photos of relatives who have passed. This morning, my mom asked me what time I came home the night before, and I said it was 11:40 p.m. She mentioned that our security camera reported someone at the door or someone unlocking the door at 3:33 a.m. and showed me the report on the security app. A few minutes later, the report disappeared, as if it had never popped up. My mom is quite spiritual and believes it could be an ancestor visiting our house. I, personally, am skeptical but open to spirituality, so I wanted some input. So me and my family bought our house back in 2000. We were the first to live there and moved in after the house was built. The only explanations we have is that the clothing these ghosts wear like early 1900, late 1800, and you'll know why. The first ghost made herself known when I was 12 to 14. I always had trouble sleeping at night and couldn't walk around my house at night as I felt like someone was always watching. But I always just thought that was irrational kid thinking. Or so I thought. One night I was laying on my bed not to sleep but on top of my comforter and all. I was just staring out my bedroom door into the hallway. The hallway light and bedroom light was on, and being in the second floor, I think I also had on the main entrance light on. Think of a chandelier where the entrance you can see the stairs right away and see a bit upstairs as well. I had no music or anything playing when I hear a little girl's laugh just as all the lights turn off and my door closes shut. I freaked out and started screaming when my mom came out of her room on the first floor thinking I was playing with the lights. She didn't believe my explanation that night, but I'll come back to this. The second ghost made himself known in a more creepier way. One night when I was 15 to 16 I woke up at exactly 3:14. I felt something tap my shoulder, and as I turned to see what it was, a man stood next to my bed. He appeared to be in his late 40s, early 50s, judging from his white hair and white mustache or beard and what I could only describe as Civil War uniform for the Confederacy. Only thing was his skin was very pale and his eyes had no pupils. I wanted to scream, but he only moved his finger over his lips to signify be quiet or shh. I laid in my bed frozen with fear as he walked out of my room and closing the door quietly. From that night I kept hearing him match in my upstairs hallway. Now being I was the only one that could account these spirits, I always was told I was crazy. Until my brother and mom both told me they noticed the girl. She never did anything harmful except she loves to play with us by hiding things somewhere we know we didn't leave them, as well as returning them to where they were originally after we look everywhere. Main things are keys, remotes, and small objects like nail polish or makeup. It's gotten to the point where if we lose something and we know it's not where we left it, we just say, "Little girl, we need this back," or "Little girl, we are in a rush and can't play." She'll normally put it back in its place a bit quicker. The older man was seen by my grandfather and my mom as well. My grandfather just saw him walk in the front door and directly to my parents' room. My mom would see him at night, but all he does is tip his hat to her and walks away. One night where she was crying a lot, I believe it was over losing her grandparents or her brother, he sat next to her and put his hand on her shoulder. She said he felt very cold, but she felt safe. Not sure if this means anything, but I thought it would be cool to share this with you all. Not sure if I really meet the criteria, since I don't dive for work, but I dive wrecks up in the Northeast United States, and most of our wrecks are real wrecks. i.e., not artificial reefs or purpose-sunk wrecks. It's always sort of. Not sure how to put it. Chilling? Eerie? To dive on what is basically a huge disaster site. Some wrecks are pretty much intact, relatively speaking, and others are been flattened out and are just fields of rubble. The war wrecks in particular are pretty interesting to dive on. You can sort of make your way around them, and after a while you can start to, or think you can start to, piece together what happened. Oh, here's a massive hole ripped in the hull, big cracks running vertically. Maybe this is where the torpedo impacted. Over here is just corrosion or storm damage from being underwater for decades. Sometimes you'll see personal effects sitting on the outside of the wrecks in the sand, things like boots, musical instruments, that sort of thing. As far as the strangest or creepiest thing I've ever seen, it was actually at the bottom of a quarry. I went into the deepest part of the quarry. IRC it was around 100, and the bottom appeared to be completely flat, with the occasional pile of goose shit here and there. Getting closer to the bottom, you saw that there were actually what appeared to be tiny worms writhing all over the bottoms, completely blanketing the entire area, like a little boiling sea of worms, everywhere. Sometimes on night dives, you'll get surprised by a curious animal. All of a sudden you look to your right and there's just a big eye, or pair of eyes, staring at you as you shine your light over there, and you get a second or two to see what it is before it darts away, typically squid, less often fish. I guess my last one was one time I was diving in the vicinity of where a company was testing underwater drones, and sometimes you can hear them in the water with you. I need some outside perspective to make sense of this because I am at a loss. I can't quite remember how old I was, maybe 5-ish? I have this super vivid memory, and I can't quite make sense of it. My mom just brought it up tonight, and it was crazy hearing it from her perspective. One night when I was around 5, we had some family friends come over with their kids. We had an underground room beneath the house that was like a basement or spare bedroom area. All of us kids loved playing in the downstairs room. That night, we built a fort with some mattresses and blankets. The family friends went home later that night, and I remember my mom tucking me into bed. We had a whole goodnight routine for all of my teddies so they didn't feel left out. I fell asleep in my bed. I woke up later in the night because I felt cold. I was in the blanket fort, in the downstairs room. I bolted awake. I was so scared of the dark and was so confused as to how I got there. The downstairs room had a bit of an eerie vibe on a good day, and this night it was so dark and cold. I felt like I was being watched and closed in on, like the same panic you get when you run up the stairs quickly at night. I bolted out of the downstairs room, up to the ground level, where the backyard was, and then up the back stairs to the back door. I was sobbing, screaming, and pounding at the back door. I woke my whole house up, my parents and sister. My parents rushed to the door to unlock it. They double-checked the door and windows, and everything was closed and locked. Everything locks from the inside. My mom brought it up tonight, and we've talked about it before a bit in the past. But I asked her what she remembered. She put my sister and me into bed. She said she woke up to me banging on the back door and screaming. My parents got me inside and tucked me in again after a lot of comfort and snuggles. My mom said she was sure she tucked me into bed and that she has no idea how or why I got outside when the whole house was locked. Also, I would never do that as a 5-year-old. The house we were living in at the time had a bit of spiritual presence, real weird unexplainable things that have happened but nothing scary or malicious, just making themselves known or residual hauntings. It's only happened once or so each time, but we had unexplainable and very clear footsteps, knocking, full body apparitions, and other weird things happen. I did sleepwalk a bit as a child, maybe an explanation? But also, how did I get out of the house when all the doors and windows were locked and could only be locked from the inside? There is no way I had the cognitive ability to lock up after myself or have a house key, and the windows locked from the inside at 5 years old. For my own sanity, I've been trying to make sense of this because the alternative is a real kick in the pants. I'm thinking more of a paranormal experience. Which is and also ook. So my question for you is, what the heck happened? How could I have gotten out of the house and ended up in the mattress fort we had built in the downstairs room? Do you have other theories or questions as to what happened to me? Please help. I was a keen sailor. Once I was out snorkeling in the Whitsundays. Having a blast checking out Nemo and all his mates. Just floating about, in the zone as it were. Well, that zone was rudely interrupted when I suddenly realized I was surrounded by a swarm of jellyfish. All around me, out of the blue. What the F? Australia? Naturally I freaked out, but some sort of survival instinct kicked in, otherwise I probably would have drowned myself in a flumux. I just gently, carefully, floated the F out of there and then sped back to the boat. Honestly, it was rather horrific, even if it doesn't sound that bad. One time when I was in middle school, my dad had a boat and we were going out to deep sea fish in the waters between Mexico and California. We saw about 3 aircraft carriers and a couple other ships all surrounding this area of about 5 miles. We didn't know what it was, but we continued to go out to fish, and then a couple hours later we heard the loudest boom I've ever heard in my life. We looked around and spotted an aircraft carrier, and my first thought was that they were firing a missile at us, lol. Then while we were heading back to the docks we started to see TVs, dressers, and other random things floating in the water. We actually caught an El Dorado hiding under the dresser too. But anyways, we found out it was when the US captured one of the biggest drug cartel leaders, and the Coast Guard and military was bringing him to the US on boat, and then an aircraft carrier blew the drug cartel leader's boat up when we heard the loud boom. Which explains everything once we found that out. But that was the creepiest thing I have seen out there. We went sailing in the British Virgin Islands for a vacation when I was 16 with another family, 2 sets of parents, myself, and their 13-year-old, for 10 days on a 30-ish foot sailboat. I can't remember, it felt small. I am terrified of swimming in water where I can't see the bottom, but there it was crystal clear. It was halfway through our trip and we went to visit and snorkel the wreck of the Rhone, which looked just under the water from the surface but was actually pretty far down. The water started to get too choppy for my taste, and seeing the scuba divers and huge tarpon fish, harmless, was making me uneasy, so I told everyone I was going back to the boat. They all decided to follow to our mooring. When I got close to the boat I noticed something under the boat. The keel part of the boat has always scared me for some reason too, so I try to avoid looking at it. As I get closer, the rest of the crew following me, I realize it is a 5 Barracuda. This thing is nasty and just hanging under the keel like it wasn't moving. Of course I knew they were dangerous, but I also had on jewelry, a belly ring, 90s, and a shiny gold swimming suit. I stop dead, everyone else gathers behind me, and a few of us surface to decide how we will approach the ladder of the boat while the rest watch said fish for movement. Being that I had tons of adrenaline and was a competition swimmer, I offered myself up first. I swam the fastest I've ever swam and pulled myself up as fast as I could, looking it directly in the eye until I surfaced. The rest of the crew, not quite as nimble as I am, I'm pretty sure there was some rum involved, hung back. The fish didn't move, so one by one they frantically swam to get on the boat. That fish did not get to taste any of our crowd. It didn't stop there. The water started to get even more choppy. I had on a motion sickness patch because I had never been on a sailboat so long, so I was okay. But suddenly tropical storm warnings start to come across the radio as a giant gray cloud closes in. It went from a beautiful tropical day to hell within 15 minutes. We scrambled inside, life vests, radioing as they rushed to take down the sails. Suddenly a gust of wind took the mainsail and almost dipped the entire boat sideways. The mast was within feet of the water. My decision to swim back to the boat early, barracuda and all, proved to have been almost intuitive. For the next few hours there was zero visibility in the scariest moments of my young life. We were no longer moored, so they just took down the sails, faced the bow into the wind and basically motored in place. We couldn't see the islands, any other ships, just pelting rain and the boom of the hull hitting trough of each wave. They had to take turns steering because it was blinding and disorienting, and took turns riding out the storm inside. I don't remember how high they said the waves were, but I remember feeling a sense of imminent death. When I'm afraid, I mean petrified, I shut down and everything happens in slow-mo. With each wave it felt like the boat went flying up into the air on the crest, then a moment of flying feeling, then crashing down so hard that I was sure the hull of the boat was going to split open. This went on for hours. So, to paint the picture, I am just sitting at the table holding on for dear life and dodging falling unsecured items in my life jacket. The 13-year-old is screaming and crying we are going to die over and over in different ways. My mother has her head in the garbage can and is holding on trying to throw up, until finally her fear kicks in and things start coming out of both ends every time she heaves. Then I'm consoling her that it's okay. The three others are coming in and out for breaks. Each time we can see that it looks more and more like a hurricane outside. Eventually I find my composure, yell at the girl to shut the F up because she isn't helping anyone, and move some towels under and around my mom and try to help her clean up while she cried, which she was trying desperately to console me but was too seasick to get a word in. But she knew I was emotionally mature enough to do the best I could to take charge. It felt like hours of near death, up and down, silence then crash, flying then feeling the boat would crack, over and over while everyone else is screaming at each other. Finally, hours later, it just stops. Dead calm. We see we are approaching an island, Virgin Gorda or Peter Island, I can't remember, and as if nothing happened we pull up into the marina on a calm and quiet sea. None of us talk really until our feet hit the dock, except my mother, whom I helped shower off and clean up. We cheered, hugged, laughed, I finally cried, and we walked ashore to get the F away from that boat for a while. We found a gorgeous bath facility attached to the marina and showered and basked in light of being alive. We asked what is the nicest restaurant here? And were directed to this small quaint place right on the water. We ate and drank, I was legal there, ordered giant plates of delicacies, and just laughed in wonder about how happy we were to be alive, no crashing into anyone or an island, drifting, running out of fuel, boat breaking in half, being swept away or drowning. We were happy to be alive, though I haven't been on a single hull sailboat since. I prefer catamaran style now, I guess.
Story time.
Last October I was in California for roughly 11 days after my brother's wedding in San Diego. I just wanted to drive around the state and visit California places that had captured my imagination over the years, and I loved driving almost as much as I loved cars. I don't necessarily believe in Sasquatch, but I would never discount someone else's experience, especially if I wasn't there, so off I went. Clipper Mills is in the foothills of the Sierra Nevadas, about 70 miles northeast of Sacramento. Very near that dam was in danger of failing last year, pretty remote. So after Bodega Bay, I had to cross the state for my destination, arriving near Sacramento in time for a late dinner. So it's after dark when I set out on the final leg, very dark. It takes me a good while on all the twisty turning roads to find my way there. I wanted to get to the exact spot the person who posted the video parked that night. He wouldn't say in his video, so I poked around YouTube's comment sections and related videos and found out more or less about the spot. Around 11 p.m., I pulled my rented Camry well off the dark two-lane road to avoid any issues with the very sparse traffic. I saw no one whatsoever, so I sat in the darkened interior, listening, allowing my eyes to dark adapt for about 20 minutes. I heard nothing but assorted insects as I sat there, saw nothing move at all. Eventually, not wanting to activate the car's interior lighting, I crawled out of the driver's side window into the black night, armed with my cell, with no service, a handheld GPS to find my way back should I get lost in the dark, and a red flashlight I use with my telescope. I stood there right by that car window for a solid 2 minutes before I could screw up the courage to move away from my Camry. Eventually, I walked up the road, still not hearing anything but bugs. Suddenly, without conscious decision to do so, I veered right and headed up into the woods. My feet were crunching pine needles now, and to my mind, I sounded like Bigfoot stomping around. After about 20 minutes, I stopped to listen, and added to the insects, I heard this faint screeching sound far off in the blackness, and it didn't sound insect-like at all. It had more consciousness to it. Then, now also thoroughly dark adapted, my mind was whispering that it sounds like a person in distress or a large primate. I remained still. I heard something small scurrying around in the underbrush as well, followed a minute later by that same forlorn-sounding wail, but now closer. Time to return to the car. As I was walking back to the car, I heard this spooky sound every 20 to 30 seconds, and now it was coming from behind me and in front of me. It seemed to have a vocabulary of some sort to me, different vocalizations, some guttural, some high-pitched, and everywhere in between. My mind was having fun just messing with me. Now, I was never so happy to see a Camry in all my life. I started it up before my ass was in the seat, I think, and half expected to see scores of red eyeballs glowing at me in the headlights from the dark forest in front of me. Now spooked, in my mind telling me some homicidal axe-wielding lunatic was nipping at my heels. I went back the way I came at a much quicker pace than I had arrived. Out of nowhere, right in front of me, this black lab ran out of the woods on one side of the road and into the woods on the other. I barely missed crushing him. That scared the hell out of me right there. I slowed down a bit, and the thought of nearly mowing down an innocent mutt overcame my mind. Some hour down the road towards Sacramento is when I noticed I had cell service again. I opened my Expedia app and found a nearby hotel for the night. Once safely enclosed in the hotel room, I began scouring the internet on my iPad and came to the conclusion that what I heard was a barred owl or a western screech owl. Can never be 100% sure, I suppose. Very creepy though, and I'm done with wandering alone in the dark at night, I think. This took place in the summer of 2004, around July, in the Bristol Bay County. I am a commercial fisherman in Alaska and have been doing so since 1970. I'm an avid outdoorsman, hunter, and someone who just loves to get out there. Every year after fishing, I try to take a trip upriver with a friend or two to wind down and enjoy ourselves before we go home. This year, while I was on this trip into Alaska's interior, our main mission was to take pictures of bears and the surrounding wildlife to promote a new bear viewing and sports fishing business. While on our 5-day trip, we spotted more than 40 bears. I took hundreds of pictures of these bears and their tracks, one of which was so big it put chills up my spine and gave me and my companions a very uneasy sense of insecurity. What set this track apart from the others was its enormous size and human-like shape. In one of the pictures that I took of this track, I placed my foot next to it on the ground. Keep in mind I'm wearing a size 13 boot. Whatever made this track was so heavy, heavier than the biggest bear, that it had pushed the gravel so far into the earth that it made us truly speculate what we were looking at. Other pictures that we took of the bear tracks were nowhere close to that indentation that this track had left. One of the most intriguing things about this track was that there were no visible claw marks. With all the other bear tracks, both of us felt extremely uneasy of our surroundings and had the feeling that we were being watched. For the rest of the day, we didn't have much to talk about, and that night felt uncomfortable at camp. We never heard or smelled anything out of the ordinary. To this day, I'm not really sure what we saw, and I'm not making any claims other than the words I have put forth. I've only heard of one other story from an old native man that lived by himself, a true hermit. He spoke of a tall creature that walked on two legs and watched him for 30 minutes from across the river, which his cabin overlooked approximately 200 feet away. When first sighted, he was motionless, staring straight at him. Then this creature, which he named Hairy Man, turned and briskly walked away. Here's my Dogman story. Let me know what you think. Well, let's see. I'll start by saying that I wasn't expecting anything unusual to happen. My partner, Steve, and I attended his friend's annual CB get-together at Grant County Park in Cryptid, Kentucky. It's about 45 minutes away from our home. It was the 1st of October, and the weather was pleasant, in the 70s. The park spans 54 acres, offering plenty of space to explore, including a playground area, a baseball diamond with lights, and a basketball court. Additionally, the picnic area features 5 shelter houses, a horse ring with a barn and stadium, and 2 multi-purpose buildings. I love nature, so the ample space appealed to me, especially when dealing with people. I brought a few joints with me to help with pain and keep me calm. The get-together lasted from noon until whenever, and many people showed up. I brought cupcakes with us, but to my chagrin, I later learned that Steve's friend was diabetic and sugar was a no-go. So, not the best first impression, but oh well, screw it. After grabbing something to eat, I decided to take a walk around since Steve knew most of the people there. Our picnic spot was up front, so I decided to explore the other side while smoking and taking in the surroundings. During my walk, I took pictures here and there with my phone, as I enjoy photography. I couldn't help but notice that I was being drawn to the woods behind the baseball diamond, and goosebumps covered my arms instantly. I felt a strong urge to go to that spot, even though I didn't sense any malevolence. It was just incredibly eerie to me that the pull was so strong. I knew something was there. I took out my phone and stopped walking, standing close to a tree that had caught my eye. I took a few pictures there and then started heading back to where everyone was, even though I still felt the strong urge to go to the area that had drawn me. Later that night, when we were back at home, I looked at the pictures I had taken and applied some grayscale effects to them because they looked awesome that way. I noticed that in one of the grayscale pictures of the tree, there was a distinct figure resembling a spirit. You could see it quite clearly. I showed it to Steve, and he thought it was cool but then asked about something by the bush. That's when I saw it, a pair of eyes staring at me from the area I had been drawn to. I got goosebumps immediately upon seeing it. I initially thought I had captured a hellhound in my photo, but when I finally showed my pictures to my friend Teresa, who was into UFOs, Bigfoot, and the paranormal, I knew she'd be interested. When I told her where I took the pictures, she informed me it wasn't a hellhound but a dogman. As a believer with an open mind who has seen and experienced many things, I thought it was incredibly cool. Teresa, on the other hand, didn't share my enthusiasm and warned me that I was lucky it didn't follow me home. Nevertheless, I didn't feel threatened by it or anything of the sort. Ready is a term that has shown up in many stories about close encounters of the third kind. I am very much on my guard for when this word shows up because I have had an encounter in which the word was spoken to me by a reptilian. In August 1959, my parents and I were traveling to Colorado Springs on a vacation. This was before my 11th birthday on August 19th. For some unknown reason, Dad decided that we would stop and visit Mount Compilations, an extinct volcano in the northeast corner of New Mexico. Mom stayed in the tourist center while Dad and I climbed up the side of the volcano and down into the crater. Then we returned to the center. I had a desperate need to go to the bathroom. As I was walking through the center, I felt myself stop in mid-step. I felt my mind lift out of my body and drop straight through the floor. How deep, I cannot imagine. My drop ended in an arched tunnel deep underground. The tunnel was lighted with orange lights. Standing in front of me was a smallish being or entity that I now know to identify as a reptilian. I would estimate its height at somewhere around 4 feet tall. It was wearing a gray color robe with long sleeves and a hood. The most I could see of its face was intense, oversized dark eyes. In its left hand, number of fingers unclear, but definitely a thumb, it held something that we today would describe as an iPad or the like. In its right hand, it held some kind of stylus. It looked straight at me, and with mind-to-mind talk, said, testily, "What are you doing here? We're not ready for you yet." Then my mind zoomed back up through the ground and back into my head, where I stood in the tourist center. Immediately, I double-timed it to the ladies' room, and got relief just in time. Since then I have lived, wondering when the we that this alien or entity represented would be ready for me. I have had other encounters with UFO-related entities, like the MIB dressed in a black warrant officer uniform, driving a yellow Mini Cooper, on the military base near Keflavik, Iceland. He told me, "Go home," and pointed towards the Southwest and North America. Maybe the aliens or entities have visited me, and I don't remember it. Thanks for letting me tell my story. I used to work about 30 miles away from where I live. One night, I had been stuck in heavy traffic, coming home. I take Lasix, so after a while, I really had to go to the bathroom. I kept telling myself that I was almost home and tried to hold it until I got there. By the time I got to my exit, I knew I wasn't going to make it to my house, so I pulled up to an area where Fidelity Investments is located and found an area that was isolated. This area is heavily wooded, with walking trails and a lot of game, but it is also in a very populated area. I pulled up a little side drive, off one of the main roads. That little drive is about 100 feet long, with only room for one car. It went up in elevation and had bushes on the right side, facing the main road. On the left side, there was a guardrail and a view of the valley below. The area up there is huge and isolated, with several buildings that are all spaced out. The place is dark at night because there are intermittent street lights up there. At night it's pretty deserted too. A few cars go through that area, though, because it's a shortcut people use to go from Taylor Mill over to 3 Liters Highway, where there are stores, restaurants, etc. When you're up there, you're above everything around this area. When I stopped, I got out of my car, waited a moment and looked around, to make sure there were no other cars. It was winter, so the bushes between where I was and the road below me didn't have many leaves on them. Because of that, you could see right through them. I was up on this little rise, about 20 or 30 feet above the drive, which was 4 lanes wide. To the left of me was a street light and more woods that went down another hill, to the main road. I went to the back of my car and did what I had to do. When I finished, I stood up and all at once, every hair on my body stood up. I knew I wasn't alone. I scanned the area in front of me and must have heard something behind me because I turned around and there were 3 deer standing there, all huddled up together, between my car and the guardrail. They weren't looking at me. They were looking across the road. I looked back over there and that was when I saw a figure standing between the bushes in front of it and the tree line behind it. It was huge. I stand 5'5". Some of those bushes were about 6 feet tall, but they only came up to about the collarbone area on this thing. Due to the street light, to the right of it, about 20 feet away, I was able to get a pretty clean outline of this thing. It had a large dog-shaped head and pointed ears. I couldn't make out its neck, but I could make out massive shoulders. That's when it growled. It was a deep vibration I could feel in my chest. My body just took over at that point. I have to explain this part of it to you. I worked security for years, in California, in the music business. As a woman, I have to really work out and train to defend myself. I kickboxed for 8 years and worked out every day. I also trained dogs. Mainly Anatolian Shepherds and German Shepherds. Sometimes, I have to establish who is the alpha, and to do that, I get them down, hold them in place, grab them by their ear and growl until they submit. Then the training can start. So, when this thing growled at me, it was just pure instinct. I dropped down to a crouching position and growled, right back at it. When I did that, it stopped growling and started sniffing the air. Its snout went up and it turned its head slightly as it was sniffing. It then took a few steps forward. I was still crouched down, on all fours, and moved forward, still growling at the thing. When I did that, it stopped. I stood up and kept staring right at it. I never broke eye contact with it. Then, it slowly stepped back into the tree line, until I couldn't make it out as clearly as before, and started to move to the right of me. The deer were still behind me. They were so close I could have reached out and touched them. I waved my arms and told them to get out of there. When I did that, they went back over the guardrail and took off down the hill. That's when I jumped in my car and got out of there as fast as I could. I felt this thing was trying to circle behind me, and I wasn't going to wait around for that. Do I think I scared it? No. But, I do think I confused it for a couple of minutes, and that gave me time to move. I told my husband about what had happened up there, but I didn't tell him exactly what I saw. He would think I was nuts, and to be honest, I thought I was a little crazy myself until I saw a picture of a dog man. I know there are other things in this world that can't be explained. I've seen them. But, this was beyond any of those things. Since this has happened, I can't take that shortcut through that area anymore. My husband took me back over that way once to see the area, and I was begging him to get me out of there the whole time. I thought I was going to throw up. The wildlife up there has almost totally disappeared. I never see anything up on the hills anymore. The street I live on is only about 1 mile or so down the hill from this place, and lately, we have seen coyotes on the streets, like they have been chased out, and pets here have started to go missing. We've also seen a large, black figure moving through our backyards down here. The dogs throughout the neighborhood go crazy regularly now, too. People were calling the cops when we saw that large, black figure jumping fences. I'm concerned that it has come down the hill, after eating everything up there. We lived on my grandfather's property in the early 1970s. He had about 75 acres in southern Ontario, Canada, near French River Provincial Park. On the property was a swamp. We hunted bullfrogs in the summer. There was also a beaver meadow that gave us an eerie feeling as if we shouldn't be there. Many times there were no sounds in that area, almost a dead zone. Occasionally, we heard a knocking wood sound, but at the time it was not a thing that we knew about Bigfoot. We didn't know creatures would do that. My grandfather had an old sap shanty along the meadow that was in disrepair, and it had started to shift and fall over. The weird feelings that we got when we were there were creepy. One night, 5 of my friends and I were taunting each other to ride our mini bikes back to the beaver meadow in the dark. I was lucky enough not to need an excuse to participate, as my headlight wasn't working. Then we noticed a small but bright light coming from the beaver meadow, and it hovered about 40 feet off the ground. It didn't move until all of us were looking at it. It suddenly veered to the left, fast enough to leave a light streak, like a sparkler when you swing it around. Then it stopped. Then it would start again for a few seconds, then it would stop. This continued for about 10 minutes until it started to expand and change its shape. It was not saucer-shaped nor egg-shaped. It was more oblong. No lights were flashing, and the whole craft gave off a bright white light. As we watched, it seemed to grow ever so slightly, so slow that it took a few seconds for us to realize it was moving towards us. The area it had come up out of was about a quarter-mile away from us. There was nothing in the field to impede our view. It was a cool night and no insects were making a sound. At about 50 or so meters from us, we saw it clearly. It was bright white with no windows or external markings. The closer it came, the clearer we could see what looked like a single object emitting a light that seemed to create a circle directly under it. It never sped up or slowed down until it hovered directly over our small group. It stopped without any sound and stayed in place for what seemed to have been a minute or two. We could see it was around 10 meters above us. It didn't spin or hum. It just hovered. We didn't feel any movement of air, no heat, or any other sensation. But we were in awe at what we were witnessing. Then suddenly, it took off straight up and blended into a pinpoint of light among the sea of stars above us. We stood around for about an hour or so trying to figure out what we had just seen. Just before we were ready to leave for the night, we started to hear the wood knocking coming from the woods along the beaver meadow. Frankly, it scared us. We quickly got on our motorbikes and hauled our butts out of there. The next summer, 3 of us were near the beaver meadow one early evening. As the light started to fade, we again observed a very bright white object hovering near the woods. Suddenly, we heard 4 distinct and loud wood knocks, that were followed by a deep growling roar. We were frozen in shock. We looked in the direction of the woods and saw several lighted objects rising out of the woods, ascending above the trees, and quickly moving up into the darkening sky. Then we heard 4 more wood knocks and crashing sounds in the woods. We quickly got out of the area. That was the last time that I ever visited the beaver meadow. My grandfather sold the property not long after that and moved to Guelph, Ontario. I never found out why he sold the property, but I do know that he did so quickly. A male employee, approximately 62 years old, working at a water treatment facility on the east side of Cincinnati, was conducting his nightly rounds. He needed to drive to a specific tank and open a valve. As he drove down a rural road dotted with houses, he noticed something standing in front of a garage on his right, illuminated by a bright overhead light. He put his truck in reverse and backed up to get a better look, eventually stopping at the foot of the driveway. The creature he saw was standing roughly where an SUV was parked on the right side. The image on the right reveals a light pole directly across from a basketball hoop. I was told that there was another light brightly illuminating the area near the garage door, but I couldn't see it from my vantage point. The driveway was approximately 50 feet long. These images were captured from inside a car, just as the witness would have seen them. For the privacy of the residents, who were not interviewed, I blurred out the house and license plate numbers. It makes me wonder if they have any idea about what lurks around their house at night. The witness described a bizarre creature that he estimated to be about the size of a man. It had brown leathery skin but had regular animal hair on the head, neck, and chest. He mentioned a canine head with a long muzzle and pointed ears on top. According to him, the legs were dog-like, but the arms appeared man-like. Interestingly, the creature stood in an unusual pose, similar to a yoga position called intense side stretch. The witness said that instead of forming a V shape, the creature's legs formed more of a horseshoe shape, which made sense if they were canine-type legs. The creature's arms hung down in front, but the witness wasn't sure if they were touching the ground or its own foot. Strangely, the creature didn't move but kept one eye on the witness, maintaining a profile view. The witness reported a sort of sneer on the creature's face, as if it were saying, "You see me, don't you?" He said the overall feeling about this creature was that it was bad news. The witness and the creature stared at each other for about a minute, with the creature remaining in place, just looking at him. Eventually, the witness continued on his duty up the road. When he returned about 8 minutes later, the creature had vanished. I was taken to the water tank, which employees must attend every morning at 4 a.m. As the crow flies, This tank is only about 100 yards from where the sighting occurred. This is where the witness was heading at the time of the sighting. The employee goes there alone each morning at 4 a.m., drives up to the locked gate, opens it, then walks into the enclosure to open a valve on this tank. On the right side of the driveway is a dense hedge of trees and honeysuckle. On the other side of that hedge is a small field with an outbuilding and parking lot, followed by the road, and on the opposite side, the house where the sighting took place. To the right of the tower is mostly farmland. One can feel quite isolated in the dark at this tank. My friend pointed out that going into the gate to the tank isn't bad, but on the way back, your headlights are in your face, making it hard to see. For some time before the sighting, the witness had expressed his uneasiness about coming to this particular location. He always felt like something was watching him. It's worth noting that this witness is far from a coward and is actually known for being a bit of a badass. However, he had long felt uncomfortable about coming here in the dark. The locations of this tank, the water treatment facility, and the sighting are very close to a state park, a wildlife area, a lake, a large creek, and railroad tracks. Unfortunately, I haven't yet obtained permission from the witness for a direct interview, but I'm still holding out hope. This information comes from my friend, who works with the witness. I encountered a reptilian hybrid several years ago while attending college in Oregon. This individual was extremely manipulative with words and dangerous with its deeds. Once I told him that he was a cold-blooded bastard after he humiliated a friend. He became very angry, staring at me with a hideous glare. He said I would suffer for my disrespect. That night while studying in my dorm room, I was alarmed by a shadowy figure starting to manifest. I am sensitive to energy, so I immediately started to raise the vibration in the room. It quickly dissipated. That startled me, so I was on full alert. Later that night at approximately 2 a.m. I awoke from what I thought was a dream, but alarmed by a grotesque reptilian form on top of my body attempting to choke me. It screeched and wailed like it was taking great delight in my fear and pain. I struggled and finally threw the fiend off me. As it cowered on the floor glaring at me, I immediately knew it was the individual I had insulted earlier. It thrust itself at me. I reached for my pants on my desk chair to retrieve my pocket knife. It was choking me as I pulled the weapon from my pants pocket and toiled to open the blade. I was able to push it off, long enough to slash it across its left arm and upper chest. With a howl of rage, it ran to the wall and disappeared through it. I turned the light on to fully illuminate the room and noticed blood on the knife, bed sheets, and floor. I checked myself to make sure it wasn't my blood. I was awake the rest of the night and ready to strike if I needed to defend myself. I was exhausted in the morning but made my way to class. I noticed the individual coming out of his dorm room. He had a bandage on his left arm in the same spot where I had cut the reptilian. He noticed me and walked directly to me nose to nose. He glared at me with those evil reptilian eyes. "Watch your back, because this isn't over," he murmured. I walked past him and made my way to class. Later that day, the dorm staff and housing administrators wanted to talk to me. While I talked to one of the dorm staff regarding this individual, the administrator blurted out, "Don't provoke him. It's important that you not cause trouble for him." The dorm staff was obviously terrified of this guy and behaved like his minions. This was startling. That same night I felt wary of a presence watching me. That sense of dread continued for several weeks until I moved off campus to avoid this hostile individual. However, I often noticed him and his acquaintances blatantly watching me when I was on campus and in town. I know that I wasn't the only person affected by this guy, but no one ever dared to discuss it. Many strange things happened as well, including the sudden death of 2 students in that same dorm. No details of those deaths were ever disclosed, just that they died because of medical reasons. I know others are out there who are aware of the reptilians and that there are ways that humanity can use to defend itself against them. I have been fortunate to meet several people who safeguarded themselves and family. These terrible beings are a scourge that we will continue to confront. Be safe, Mason. It doesn't matter where I'm employed as a park ranger. What does matter is my secret job, the thing that I do when I'm off the grid, so to speak. A werewolf started appearing about 6 months ago, and I'm still not sure why. At first, we got calls from visitors saying they encountered grizzly bears, or something approximating one, deep in the forest. For the first few months, we got maybe a dozen calls. After that, things really started to ramp up, daily, or rather, nightly, sightings. Despite that, no one could really get a good look at the thing everyone assumed to be bear. Then my boss showed up, a man I rarely saw. He tossed a tranq dart gun at me and told me to head into the woods. Whatever you do, don't kill the thing. Based off the information we've been able to gather, this is no damn bear. Something possibly supernatural. Does this have anything to do with Elijah's disappearance last month? Something killed Elijah, and we never found the body. James only gave a slight nod, something that could be denied later if asked. The less you know the better, Liam. Just take your truck and head into the woods. I'll mark the most recent sighting on your map, James said, crossing his arms and giving me a look that told me not to ask any more questions, but I couldn't help myself. Guess some weird government agency is involved in this if you're telling me not to kill it. You'd think the safety of the visitors would come first, I said, but James cut me off. Now, officially, that's none of our business, Liam. Just taking orders. You'd be wise to do the same. So I closed my mouth and got to work, loading my vehicle with some last-minute things I thought I might need, food or water or binoculars. Then I got in the truck and drove down the winding road. I decided to not get on the walkie because I didn't want to alert James. My plan was this: pick up Bill, my partner in crime more or less, at his usual patrolling location, then head off to where the location James marked on the map and see if we couldn't tag team this thing. I caught Bill just sitting in his patrol truck reading an Agatha Christie novel and smoking a cigarette. I remember him telling me how relaxing he found it. Being out here, not a care in the world, tending to his biological needs, the cigarette, and the needs of his higher brain, the Agatha Christie novel. Hey, Bill, we got a situation James wants us to look into. Bill looked up from his novel, mildly irritated. What kind of situation? Gotta tranq something. You know, that thing that everyone thinks is a bear but probably isn't. Why tranq instead of kill? Yeah, I was wondering that, too. Anyway, hop in, good buddy. We got a long night ahead of us, and that's putting it really mildly. Bill got in and we drove off in the direction of the last sighting. I filled Bill in on what little I knew. Guess the thing that really concerns me is why now? Why a month after Elijah's death? Bill asked, thumbing through the book in his hands but not really reading it. That caught my attention, too. I don't know the reason. I just know that something fishy is going on. Then that's when we saw it. A large, hairy beast. Running on all fours, then randomly standing upright and roaring. Our headlights seemed to confuse the thing. Bill took out his pistol, rolled down the window and fired. Bill, what the F are you doing? No lethal force is allowed on this thing. We gotta use the tranq gun. The thing, which upon closer inspection looked exactly like a werewolf, just roared and charged at the truck, grabbing its bottom and shaking it violently until Bill and I were completely disoriented. It then leapt into the trees. What the F is wrong with you? I said to Bill again once my head stopped spinning. I said no lethal weapons. Sorry, Liam. Just got rattled is all. Wasn't going to get turned to human paste because a pair of government-issue sunglasses told us not to us actual bullets. Bill replied, face flushed. Well, after that I began to drive again, keeping our eyes peeled for the werewolf. We heard howls coming from the infinite line of trees to our left. No matter how much we combed the woods, we didn't find anything. This went on for several nights, experiencing horrific sightings of the massive man-wolf. I went by myself after the first night because I didn't trust Bill not to fire bullets at the thing. James was ripping me a new ass because I couldn't track the damn thing down, at least, not keep it in my sights long enough to trank it. On the fourth night, I sat in my truck on the side of a wide road, scanning the eerily still line of palm trees. My ears pricked as I heard the soft crunch of twigs as Tired crushed them. I peeked in the rear view mirror and saw a sleek black car parking behind me. A short woman with red hair came out of the car, using precise movements so that not 1 ounce of energy was wasted. "Are you Liam?" the woman asked, popping into my window like she was a cop about to give me a ticket. I heard the trees rustle behind her and began to perspire a little on my forehead. "I'd tell you that you shouldn't be out this way, ma'am, since we've had a few bear sightings out this way, but," I started. "I don't mean to be blunt, but I outrank park rangers." Again, not trying to be a jerk, just stating a fact. The woman seemed fairly young, and her smile sent a shiver down my spine because it was so emotionless. She explained to me what was going on. She worked for a government agency, one I hadn't heard before, and they had been working on a serum to reverse the transformation of the werewolf. They were hoping I could sedate the thing before it did any real damage or chose to move on to an even broader wilderness. "There has been a reason why this werewolf has been so good at evading you, and I'm not sure it has anything to do with it having preternatural abilities," the woman said. She finally introduced herself as Sarah Perkins. "Here, take this tranq gun. It comes with a special tranquilizer that will not only sedate the werewolf, but also hopefully reverse his transformation. It hasn't been tested on his kind, since we believe he is the only one of his kind that exists," Sarah said, and handed me a much larger gun than I had, which had a small tube filled with yellow liquid fitted onto the top. She had one for herself too. We hurried into the woods, following the howls until I felt like we were dangerously close. Sarah scanned the environment, looking more vigilant than nervous. Okay, maybe a little nervous, but she hid it remarkably well. As for me, I was terrified. Not afraid to admit that since I didn't have special government training to deal with a friggin' werewolf. The trees all around us began to rustle, and before I could really get my bearings, the massive hairy beast shot from the top of one of the trees and landed on the ground. My hands shook. I tried to steady my gun, except my nerves wouldn't let me. "Steady," I said. "Steady." But I just couldn't calm my shaking hands. The beast slowly moved closer on all fours, fierce yellow eyes fixed on me. A pound of drool must have escaped from its jaws, hanging from them in thick, disgusting streams that made me want to vomit. It swiped the air with massive claws, growling. Just as I thought I was a goner, I heard the sound of a whisper whizzing by at about 100 miles an hour, landing in the beast's hairy, bulging neck. Without thinking, I fired my own gun. The dart landed in the thing's abdomen. It growled weakly and collapsed onto the ground. Sarah didn't waste any time. She ran toward the thing and placed a small chip deep into the fur of its right arm. "Tracking device," she said as its breathing slowed. The tranq or transformation dart did what she claimed. The beast began to shrink. The fur started to go back into the skin. It all happened so quickly that at first I didn't believe what I was seeing. I went over to the man, who shivered and rubbed his arms. The transformation had taken a toll on him. It took me a minute, but I recognized the man. "Elijah," I said under my breath. "You're alive. How is this even possible?" "Well, congratulations, Sarah," a man's voice said from behind. "You got to subject X first. You won the bet." I turned around. Bill, what is going on?" I asked, tone clearly frazzled. Sarah jumped in. "We work at the same agency. We had a little bet going. Whoever got to the werewolf first could do with it as it pleased. Kill it, or trank it and put a tracking device on it. Of course, my way aligned with the agency's. Bill here is a renegade, wants to eliminate everything in sight." Bill gave a soft chuckle. "Well, Guess I got what I want either way, Bill said, grinning and patting me on the back as he walked past me. He knelt in front of Elijah, and seemed to pluck one of the remaining werewolf hairs from one of its forearms and put it in a small glass vial. Then Sarah and Bill seemed to be talking in code, and I couldn't at all parse what they were saying. Bill came up to me afterward. "Okay, Liam. We better get out of here before the trank dart wears off. Looks like the serum's effects were only temporary. It'll completely change back into werewolf form in less than 15 minutes. Part of the transformation has already begun. The sedative will wear off in about 10 after that. But don't worry, we can track the thing with the device Sarah put on it." So we all left. Sarah in her sleek government vehicle, and Bill and I in our park ranger truck. "You can't tell James that I work for a government agency that hunts a werewolf," he said. Now, I wanted to kill the thing, wipe it off the map, but Sarah had other plans. I have to respect the bet. I lost. She won. Which means that Elijah will be roaming the woods, and we have to track him every night, study him. After a while, once the agency has all the information it needs, it will either give a kill order, and I can deliver a bullet to the thing's brain, or it will come up with a serum that will permanently erase Elijah's werewolf tendencies. So, with Bill's help, I track Elijah every night, using regular trank darts to sedate him. We take hair and skin samples, put everything into stainless steel containers that get shipped back to a secret government lab. They are working on a serum just like Bill said, one which will be permanent. I've learned to accept Bill's new identity. Aspiring werewolf killer. I'll deal with it when the time comes. I think I have additional problems to the fate of Elijah because I've gone to the workman's cabin, seeing Bill with those strange yellow eyes more than once. I'm not sure if he is a full-fledged werewolf, because he's been with me every night, and I just see him in his human form, except sometimes as we are driving along, I'll see his eyes turn yellow under the deep shadows cast by the moon. Something is clearly different. Did the sample he took from Elijah that night have something to do with it? I feel trapped in this situation. Bill seems something else besides human, and I can't abandon my post without making him suspicious. I also don't want to abandon my post because I feel like I have a duty to the visitors here to keep this werewolf at bay. And I do agree with Sarah, given the circumstances, I don't feel comfortable ending the life of a fellow park ranger. Bill's a relative newcomer, and I worked with Elijah for years before he disappeared. I don't want to give up on a fellow ranger. To be continued. My name is Tommy, and I've always been drawn to the mysterious and the unexplained. One summer, when I was just 14, my life took a turn I could never have anticipated. It all began with a camping trip to Browning's campground, a serene retreat in the heart of Versailles, Indiana. My family and friends had joined me for what should have been an ordinary adventure, but little did I know that our lives would be forever changed by the enigmatic creatures we would encounter that night. The campfire crackled, casting its warm, flickering light across our faces as we sat huddled around it. It was a typical evening, with laughter and stories filling the air. But as the night wore on, I couldn't help but feel an unsettling sense of unease. It was as though something in the woods was watching us, waiting to reveal itself. My gaze wandered toward the forest's edge, and what I saw sent shivers down my spine. Two creatures, unlike anything I had ever seen, stood there in the shadows. Their fiery red eyes, glowing with an eerie intensity, locked onto our group. They were colossal, with the body of a man but the head of a wolf, and their fur was as black as the night itself. I was the first to notice them, and I couldn't believe my eyes. I stammered, trying to alert my companions, who turned to see the unearthly beings before them. We watched in terrified awe as the creatures slowly retreated into the darkness, vanishing like specters. The memory of their red eyes would haunt my dreams for years to come. Over the next decade, the mystery of Browning's campground continued to unravel. Two of my cousins, not much older than I was when I first encountered the dogmen, had their own chilling experience. They described seeing a creature, similar to what I had witnessed, but with a different shade of fur, a menacing gray. The years passed, and more accounts of these elusive beings began to surface. Last summer, during a lively campground party, a group of revelers claimed to have seen one of these creatures lurking near their campsite. It was tall, dark, and just as menacing as the ones my cousins and I had witnessed. The red eyes, a common thread in these accounts, seemed to hold an ancient and eerie wisdom that defied explanation. As the reports continued to pile up, our small town couldn't ignore the mounting evidence and the accounts of its residents. The term Dog Man began to circulate, a moniker for these enigmatic beings that had become an intrinsic part of the folklore of Versailles, Indiana. For my family, Browning's campground had been a cherished summer tradition, but it had also become a place of mystery and unease. Every visit held the potential for another encounter with the Dogmen, and while some might dismiss our stories as mere campfire tales, those fiery red eyes were etched into our memories, a reminder that there are mysteries in this world that defy explanation and continue to haunt us to this day. The story takes place in Pleasant Hills, Pennsylvania, Allegheny County, south of Pittsburgh. I grew up there and had a friend who lived about 1.5 miles away from me. We didn't drive back then due to poor decision making, so we had to walk everywhere. I'd walk down past the local borough building, cut up through the woods, and come out on the other side. It was a shortcut to bypass the huge hills we'd have to walk up. The beginning of the hill started in Pleasant Kingdom, a playground for kids that sits back off the road in the woods with tennis courts, basketball, and typical ground stuff. We used to sled ride there because the hill was pretty massive on the backside. That hill led to the opening of our shortcut. We were walking to my house one night and we were almost clear of the woods. It was pitch black, but we could see the playground lights at the bottom about 100 yards away when we heard a disgusting sound to our right. It sounded like something was eating something else and making crazy wild animal noises, but with a human undertone. I could hear the tree limbs shaking but could not see anything. We bolted the last 100 yards downhill to the bottom and scratched our heads. We had no idea what it could have been but thought it might have been a bear. We weren't into Bigfoot back then, so it never crossed our minds. The only light was coming from the parking lot lights. It was me and my friends Steve and Jose. Jose was good at fist fighting, and we were basically afraid of nothing, especially when we were together. We were just about to turn the corner to walk the path behind the borough building to my street. For whatever reason, we all looked over our shoulders. Steve said, "WTF is that?" We all saw it walk across the pavilion upright from left to right and hide behind a tree. It was about 100 yards approximately and up the hill in the dark, but the light from the parking lot illuminated it enough that we could all see a tall gray-colored animal or man walk across the pavilion. Its head was level with a pavilion roof, easily 8 feet tall. We stood and watched, and then it simply peeked out from behind the tree as if to get its eyes on all of us. At that moment we all turned and ran as fast as we could to my house. We stopped short and looked at each other and asked, "Why are we running?" It's like it telepathically jumped into all of our minds and said, "Boo," and made 38-year-old men turn and run like babies without even knowing what we had just seen. None of us knew what it was, but it bothered us for weeks until one day Steve said, "I think I know what we saw," and said, "Bigfoot." It clicked immediately. I knew right there that I wasn't crazy and that we had definitely seen and heard a Sasquatch. I would tell people, my family and friends, and nobody believed us. But it affected me enough that I would join the Pennsylvania Bigfoot Society. I would go on investigations to interview witnesses of reports, take pictures, and walk the sites. I have a lot of pictures still from some of the interviews I was on. I came to realize that Pleasant Hills is built on abandoned coal mines, and to find out that they travel the mines to stay out of sight. Pleasant Hills is not a rural area. There are houses and neighborhoods everywhere. But there are large woods between the 3 towns that separate each other. This is the main reason people had a hard time believing my story. I know what we saw. Steve and I are both still very much into Sasquatch. I need to just get this out. I grew up surfing in Southern California. In the summer of 1991, me and my friend were in the water for 30 minutes and he told me he touched something and felt sick. He went back to the beach. 2 days later he said a doctor told him he had sickle cell anemia. Okay. The last we really talked about it, we were 15 years old. But I still remember he said, I touched something. 6 years later I was in the water and something felt weird about the whole day. Then it happened. The pain started with the slightest touch, on the inside of my forearm, so bad my hearing and sight were interconnecting and started a confusion beyond any control. All of a sudden a change in my body began. Cold freezing muscles and nerves from my toes up my legs to my lower back. The pain worsened and hallucinations of an iceberg, bales of hay, pine trees, and even a little action figure that seemed so real it almost was like trying to be a hero. Then the creature I touched beneath me almost seemed to say this is my planet and just swam teasingly below me. A voice with the message, we are thousands of years old. It rang right through all this, almost hypnotic-like with no remorse. I then got a vision of a female, mermaid-like creature. Just take it, I said to myself, nothing even close to this has ever happened to you. The speed at which it was happening was unbelievably fast and precise. I thought of fainting or dying, which seemed possible, but I could still move and swim, which made it feel like it was like a test of will. Then a sudden change of my brain and my spine felt as if it was totally and completely connected and moving together. All of a sudden I felt it, what I thought was causing all this trauma. First, it spun a web between my spine and skin on the very lower back. As I tried to stretch it out, it started another above, but slower and with a different pattern that almost felt like it protected the first one. This put me into an almost hypnotic state as I felt it crawl up into my neck, into the front right side of my brain and sit. It wiggled its legs and body, then turned to the right. The only thing I could think at that point was if I was crazy I might have killed myself. All this is still within 15 minutes. Then my stomach began to feel numb and cold, with my intestines slowly numbing. My right hip socket and femur started to act up. I could feel the whole thing precisely as it was evolving. 3 little squares made an appearance to me, each like a growth, and to the exact make of my femur, the 3 squares attached to my hip socket. This caused another hallucination. A doll action figure that had cloth clothing and detachable limbs. All are still within a 30-minute time limit. It stopped and I got out of the water. Later I learned that the clothed action figure was over 200 miles away, as if the whole experience was that large and planned out. When I thought it was over or fading away, it told me differently. This is as real as it gets. Please let me know if you have any research on this. It happened many years ago to me and I'm reliving it as I am becoming more normal. I have not contacted anyone because of my hypnotic state. I believe that was touched and communicated with a mermaid. This took place on November 15, 2012. I'm about to relay a story that few of you will believe. No, I'm not on drugs, I'm not kidding at all, not one bit. If you disbelieve my eyes, do me a favor and keep it to yourself. I know what we saw. Has anyone ever seen a military craft like this? In the dome is a swivel seat in which I saw, who I believe was, a U.S. Marine pilot in a green pressure suit with no helmet. It sounded like a diesel train. Just before I saw it, there was a series of twister-like rotational updrafts off in the distance. It was capable of changing the bearing without changing the direction it faced. It can travel very low to the ground. When I saw it, it was about 200 feet in the air. The pilot noticed me, flew within 1/8 mile close to me, nearly hovering in one spot at one point, and then headed off into the commercial flight lines with an incredible capacity for acceleration, and was easily capable of speeds approaching what I consider to be 1,000 miles an hour. I was in Vancouver, Washington, and the location I was at had a reasonably decent view of the flight lines that go to the coast, whereupon I normally watch the planes alter course and head north to Canada, or south to California. It reached the point of breaking south within 30 seconds and then simply disappeared into the night. It's definitely a UFO to me, but having seen the pilot, it was unmistakably a decorated military pilot at the helm. The height of the fuselage was about 10 feet tall, 15 feet wide at the nose and 40 feet wide at the widest point through the stern. The pilot was about 30 years old, had dark hair, and a military haircut, sitting in a pivot-style chair. The craft flew such that the stern was angled up from the elevation of the nose. I can't recall if I saw the bottom of the craft, but I remember wondering where the diesel train sound was coming from, and then I saw this in the air. I do not recall specifically any lights on the bottom of the craft, but due to the angle of the craft, the low proximity to the ground, and the distance away from me, I could not even see the bottom of the craft. I had someone with me at the time and she saw this craft as well. The surface of the craft had a look of corrugated metal which would be used on an overhang for a backyard deck along the sides of the craft, and a flat matte gray upper surface. The dome provided a 360 view of the surroundings. It was positively the most advanced aircraft I have ever laid eyes upon. I began experiencing anxiety, fatigue, insomnia, periodic headaches, unexplained cuts, scars, rashes, and bruises. I began having strange, confusing flashes of memory. At first, they were just a terrifying jumble of fragmented images, sounds, and sensations. After a few years of thinking I was starting to crack up, they eventually started to come together and become more distinct and orderly. At this point, I have a pretty clear memory of what happened. It usually happens around 2 a.m. or so. If I'm asleep, I wake up in a panic, unable to move. All my hair stands on end, and I feel an odd sensation. Almost like an electrical charge flowing through me. It's very difficult to breathe. A blinding light shines in through the windows and tall thin figures are standing all around me. I start hearing their thoughts in my head. Usually something like "don't be afraid," or "there will be less discomfort if you stop trying to resist." I raise off my bed, float outside, and raise up into the light. Here is where things vary a bit. Sometimes they just do some kind of scan. Other times they perform surgical procedures. I can remember having my head clamped in place, and needles or other instruments inserted into my skull, ears, or up my nose. Other times into my forearms, or abdomen. At some point, I lose consciousness and find myself back in my bed. I know there was at least once that they came when I was awake. It happened 3 years ago in mid-September. I couldn't sleep, so I was watching Netflix on my computer. Next thing I know, I'm waking up the next morning. I remember thinking how odd it was that I didn't remember going to bed. I made my way down the stairs where I noticed the door was open. I found my rifle lying on the front step next to 3 ejected rounds. All 3 still intact, except that their primers had been struck. So far I have not regained the memory of what happened that night. I'm not 100% sure this is related, but I just had to re-shingle my roof. I only put the new asphalt shingles on about 3 years ago, and they already started curling up and crumbling. They appeared to be scorched. I never write, but I have been reading so many stories on here, so I figure I would tell one of my own. Background: I live in a small town, but in the popular fancy neighborhood that everyone made sure to hit up on Halloween night because of full-size candy bars. My family lives on a dead end and in the deepest part of this small neighborhood, which contains my aunt's house, sisters, and mine. My house was the oldest house as well as the first house to be built before the whole neighborhood. Before it was all woods as far as I know. My aunt is very creative and artistic, so she turned this trail in her backyard to a secret garden. It was full of old angel statues, old bird fountain, a bench, and just a lot of woods. Me and my cousins always played in these woods when we were kids until we heard the old man. Note by the garden there was a super old shed made of tin and it was there before my house, I'm guessing. Also about 100 feet away a slab of old busted concrete the size of another shed covered by a ton of leaves and dirt. Just thought I would add that. The beginning I was around 8 or 9 years old and after school I wanted to go play at my cousin's house like I usually did. So I walked up to the driveway and my older cousin, male, 12, was playing with a basketball, and stopped to ask me if I have heard the old man. I was obviously confused and asked what he was talking about. He then pointed at the secret garden and said, "Listen." So we went quiet and in that instance all you heard was moaning like someone was in pain. After hearing it for over 5 minutes I ran home as it never stopped. My cousin informed my aunt about the noises we were hearing and she just thought it was nothing and brushed it off, since we were young and always played pretend in the woods. But the noise never stopped. It would grow louder or be very quiet, but never stopped. The next day my older cousin, male, 12, had a friend that lived in the next yard over, male, that had a unique name. He decided to cut through the woods as he usually did to get to my cousin's house, only to be stopped. He heard his name being called through the woods that went further back. And he was there for a few minutes, I'm guessing confused. My aunt noticed him. The kitchen window had a view of the garden, walking out and immediately dropped everything, yelling and running to him, checking and making sure he was unharmed and okay. Which freaked us out because she didn't believe us about the old man. The neighbor then said someone was calling for him in the woods, groaning his name loud. He ended up getting homeschooled even though his dad was a public school teacher. And he stopped coming over. At my house, our woods are connected, and in my backyard we have a huge shop my dad and his friend worked out of. My dad's friend was alone working in a shop with all the shop doors open and began to hear the moaning noise even over the machine equipment. So he walked down the hill to check out the noise and it stopped. He went back to work, heard the noise again and this repeated several times before he just left. Soon after this my aunt freaked out and called the police. The police heard the noise. All I remember is them saying is we didn't find a body or anything else after hours of searching our woods. This wouldn't be the first time the police were called either. At some point the groaning stopped, maybe a week or two. When it started back my aunt had called the police again to come and double check. Again they found nothing. My aunt was most likely terrified and tried not to show it. She went around surrounded areas, nearby logging company, other houses a mile away from the woods to try and get answers if they have heard it or if they are making the noises. Then my aunt started holding prayer groups with women from her church to come and pray over her home. This happened a few times. I remember seeing around 9 women in a circle praying and holding hands over the yard for minutes. The moaning stopped, and we never played in the secret garden again. I will never know the truth to what we heard. Hello, it's my first time writing something like this. I can't find any information regarding what my family is experiencing, but it's weird and happening more often. I live with my girlfriend and our 3 kids. Our house has 2 floors. The second floor has the rooms, and the first floor consists of the living room, bathroom, kitchen, and a small hall located behind our living room. Now, what is happening is that I'm a firefighter, which means I work in shifts, and I have to work at night. When I'm at home, everything is calm. However, once in a while, we hear loud noises, like something beating on an object, or bags falling seemingly out of nowhere. It's rare but does happen. On the first floor, both my girlfriend and I feel a very strong negative presence, particularly from the bathroom and the hallway. I usually close the bathroom door, which helps me feel at ease. Sometimes, I feel like someone is watching my back, especially at night when everyone is asleep. The feeling is so strong that I often turn off the TV and go upstairs. Now, the worst part is that most of the activity occurs at night when I'm at work. My girlfriend and my kids feel really scared to go to the bathroom or the first floor. They say that they feel watched and have a sense of dread. My girlfriend and I avoid discussing these things with the kids around, so it's strange that they seem to see the same things. My girlfriend says that sometimes when she turns around, she sees in the hallway or in the dark a small, faceless, black head that is always watching her. She even mentioned seeing a reflection of it when the TV turned off suddenly. My older child has also been saying that he sees a black head in the corners, watching him. He has never heard us talking about it. One night, all three of them woke up with nightmares, and they all screamed at the same time, saying that they saw a big shadow in the middle of their room. My girlfriend and I woke up with their screams, turned on the lights, but saw nothing. They managed to sleep with our presence, but the middle one is so scared that he pees in his bed instead of going to the bathroom at night. Last night, while I was at work and upon returning home, my girlfriend told me that she was in our bed with our older child, and out of nowhere, she saw a small shadow jump onto the older kid's bed. Our older child saw it too and said to her, "See, I told you there was a shadow watching us." That's when she had chills. She also mentioned that during the night, they heard loud knocking downstairs. At 3 a.m., our younger kid screamed in panic, and she saw a black, faceless head and some hands in the corner of the stairs leading downstairs. At 7 a.m., she screamed again, saying that the black, shadowy head was now on top of her, watching, and that the face was a she. My girlfriend mentioned that the head is really common, but it only watches them and disappears once spotted. What could it be? What can I do? Thanks. Okay, so just to preface this. This was on Friday the 27th and my friend and I had smoked cannabis before going out to eat and catch a movie. So my friend and I are in line at BK and trying to decide if we want to split a meal or get separate meals. My friend orders her food and when I get to order I get straight as asked if we smoked weed. My first thought and question was, is it that noticeable? Now I could barely hear this guy because he was speaking low but was asking about a certain strain that I could really care less about. But it gets to the point where he tells me how much I could get for a certain price point, which I said I would keep in mind. Now my friend and so didn't spray any perfume or body spray, we normally do but completely forgot to. I get to the table my friend picked out and I start telling her about what just happened. Not even a minute after I sit down does this guy come over and pass me a folded up napkin of this weed to sample. Now my friend and I are just shocked and talking about this. I ended up putting the napkin in my bra because it was the only place I could. I had no pockets. This guy ends up coming to our table 3 to 4 more times within the span of 15 to 20 minutes. When I went up to get my food before these other encounters occurred, this guy had let me know that he got off at 7:30 p.m. and asked if we wanted to hang out. I straight up said that my friend and I were on a date and were going to a movie straight after this. After I got my food, this guy stopped at our table to ask what movies were playing, what his name was. I don't remember what he said, just that it has something to do with California's state bird, and the other times I can't remember why he came over. He just spoke to me and not my friend, and I could tell this guy was trying to get some information on me. Now I am a very private person and also a very cautious person. I could tell this guy was trying something and I acted dumb, even though I knew what was going on. My friend had noticed that after the last time he came over that this guy was staring at me any time he passed by. I could tell he was staring at me because of the windows that made a reflection because my back was to him. It got a point where I told my friend we need to hurry because this is making me uncomfortable. So we finished quickly and left. Now my friend and I did originally go to the movie theater but decided to watch the movie at home because of how busy it was. When we decided to watch the movie at my place we tried to hurry and leave because of the time and that guy was going to be getting off any minute. I don't think I will be going to BK anytime soon because my hair color is blue. It's very noticeable and not many people have that color in my town, plus it's a smallish town. I hope to never meet this guy again, and if I do, I may have to have a backbone, especially if he acts like he did this time. Not a very interesting story, and also trying to tell this days later doesn't help. But that's my creepy encounter. I've been getting sleep paralysis since a kid, but the past 2 years, especially the past few months, have been crazy. I don't sleep for days sometimes. I'm so tired all the time cause I can't sleep peacefully. I've tried melatonin, night lights, even giving my room and house a cleanse. I've seen many things and voices when having sleep paralysis, and also have had these things physically touch me, aggressively. I wake up with fear, panic and goosebumps all over my body every time. I'll list the things I've seen while having these episodes, if that's what they even are. Baby on the edge of my bed. A man with an all-white tight suit, head to toe, including fitted mask with a red patch on his mask on the right side. A girl or woman with black hair, who covers her face with it and wears a grungy type gown or dress. She grabbed me by my wrist and left a bruise, a black figure hovering over me, while seeing flashes of white light. Just 2 weeks ago I was sleeping in bed, face down on my stomach. I don't sleep on my back, and I felt like someone got into bed with me, and I genuinely just thought it was my sister-in-law since we lived together. I remember looking over and this woman was sitting next to me with black hair and white gown. She had her back towards me while she sat on my bed by my feet. That's when I felt I couldn't move. It felt like someone was on my back pinning me down while they held my wrist down to my bed. I started hearing this woman whispering in my right ear but couldn't understand what she was saying. Then I was out of it, and again that feeling of panic or fear and goosebumps took over my whole body. It's to the point it's affecting my mental and physical health. I'd love to get help, but where do you get help for something like this? It's also to the point that it happens even when I just try to take a quick little nap. I can't rest and I feel myself getting more drained every day. I don't know if I'll get answers here, but it feels nice being able to talk about it to someone at least. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe for daily stories. We at Den of Misfits really enjoy this, and your support would be appreciated.